The garden gnomes were the first to notice them. 3 of the potato-like creatures had been engaged in what appeared to be a territorial dispute over a particularly lush patch of Molly Weasley's cabbages when the distinctive crack of apparitions split the evening air. They froze mid-scuffle, their gnarled faces swiveling toward the lane beyond the garden fence, before scattering in 3 different directions with surprising speed for creatures of their build. One dove head first into a rosebush, another wedged itself beneath the garden shed, and the third simply ran in panicked circles until it collided with a watering can. Bill Weasley smiled at the familiar chaos as his feet found solid ground. Beside him, Fleur Delacour. No, Fleur Weasley now, he reminded himself with a warm flutter in his chest. Swayed slightly, her hand tightening around his arm. "All right," he asked softly. "Oui, yes." Fleur straightened, smoothing down her silvery blonde hair with her free hand. Then she did it again, and once more, tucking a strand behind her ear that had never been out of place to begin with. Bill recognized the gesture. He'd seen it at Gringotts when she was preparing for difficult meetings with goblin account managers at their wedding, when his Aunt Muriel had made one too many cutting remarks, and last week when the post had arrived with Molly's carefully worded invitation to a simple family dinner. Nothing fancy, just us. Do come when you can. Nothing in Weasley family life was ever truly simple. "They're going to love you," Bill said, though they both knew the reality was more complicated than that. His mother had been civil during the wedding preparations, civil and correct, and utterly unlike the warm, smothering presence that had defined his childhood. It was somehow worse than outright hostility. "Your mother does not trust me." Fleur's accent, usually soft and melodic, sharpened with tension. "She thinks I am, how do you say, too pretty to be serious, no? She thinks you're too good for me," Bill corrected gently. "There's a difference." "That is ridiculous," Fleur's blue eyes flashed. "You are—" She gestured at him, apparently unable to find adequate words, which was unusual for someone who spoke 3 languages fluently. "You." Despite his own nervousness, Bill laughed. "Come on, before Mum sends out a search party." They walked up the lane toward the Burrow, their feet crunching on the gravel path that wound between overgrown hedgerows thick with evening birdsong. The sun was lowering toward the horizon, painting everything in shades of honey and gold. It was the sort of perfect summer evening that made the war seem like a distant nightmare rather than something that had ended mere months ago. The Burrow rose before them in its impossible, magnificent glory, 6 or 7 stories of crooked architecture that shouldn't exist according to any Muggle building code, and probably violated a few magical ones as well. Chimneys jutted out at odd angles. Windows gleamed at irregular intervals, some square, some round, one hexagonal for reasons no one had ever adequately explained. The entire structure leaned slightly to the left, held upright by a combination of magic, determination, and what Bill suspected was sheer stubbornness on the house's part. Fleur had stopped walking. Bill followed her gaze upward, trying to see the Burrow through her eyes. She'd grown up in what he imagined was an elegant French chateau, all symmetry and sophistication. His family home looked like it had been assembled by an enthusiastic but slightly drunk giant playing with blocks. "It's," Fleur began. "Mental," Bill supplied, barking completely off its rocker. "Parfait," Fleur finished softly. "Perfect." She looked at him, and her expression held something fragile and honest. "It is exactly what a home should be. I can see you here, climbing those trees, breaking your arm falling from that roof. That was Charlie, actually. Being loved." She took a breath. "I want them to love me too, Bill. I want to belong here." Bill pulled her close, pressing a kiss to her temple. "You already do. They just don't all know it yet." In Fleur's hands, wrapped carefully in a preservation charm, was a rectangular box containing what she'd called a tarte tatin, a French apple dessert that she'd spent 3 hours preparing that morning. Bill had watched her make it twice before she was satisfied, muttering in French about oven temperatures and caramelization and whether British apples had the proper balance of sweet and tart. She clutched it now like a shield. They passed through the garden gate, which creaked in greeting. Molly had long ago given up oiling it, as it seemed to prefer announcing visitors. The garden stretched around them in enthusiastic disorder. Fat pumpkins swelling beneath broad leaves, runner beans climbing enchanted stakes that adjusted their height to accommodate growth, and herbs that practically grew themselves, requiring only the occasional stern word when the mint tried to invade the parsley space. The kitchen door stood open, warm light spilling out along with voices and the clatter of dishes, and something that smelled powerfully of onions and thyme and home. Bill squeezed Fleur's hand once more, then called out, "Hello, we're here." The immediate response was chaos. Something crashed inside the house. Ron's voice shouted, "Get it, it's escaping," followed by Fred, or possibly George. Bill still had trouble telling them apart by voice alone, yelling, "That's not it, you pillock. That's Dad's sneakerscope." A purple blur shot out of the kitchen door and whizzed past Bill's left ear, trailing sparkles and a smell like burnt rubber. It disappeared into the garden with a sound like a deflating balloon. Catch it. George, definitely George, Bill could see him now, burst through the doorway, wand raised, his red hair standing on end, and what appeared to be flour dusted across his face. He spotted Bill and Fleur and skidded to a halt, his expression transforming from manic focus to sheepish welcome in an instant. "Oh, evening. You're here. Brilliant. Dinner's nearly ready. Just having a slight technical situation." "What was that?" Bill asked, watching the purple thing bounce off a tree in the distance. "Portable swamp prototype," George explained cheerfully. "Still working out some kinks. Meant to stay contained in his jar, but Ron knocked it over when he was trying to clean up and, well, you saw." "We were elping," Fleur said carefully, her accent thickening slightly as it did when she was nervous or amused. Bill was pleased to hear it leaning toward amusement. "George Weasley!" Molly's voice cut through the evening air like a knife. "If you've ruined dinner with your nonsense." "All under control, Mum," George called back, already retreating toward the house. "Bill and Fleur are here." There was a beat of silence from inside, then a flurry of activity. Bill could picture it perfectly. His mother straightening her apron, patting her hair into place, putting on her company face. Even though this was family, even though she'd invited them, even though she'd literally given birth to half the people in the house. Molly appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on a tea towel. Her face arranged itself into a smile that was warm and welcoming and just slightly strained around the edges. "Bill, dear, and Fleur, come in, come in. Don't stand out there. Mind the step, it's a bit wonky. Arthur keeps meaning to fix it, but you know how he is. Come in." Fleur moved forward, and Bill noticed her posture shift, spine straightening, shoulders back, chin lifting slightly. She was putting on armor made of grace and poise, the same way his mother put on that smile. Two women, preparing for battle, disguised as dinner. "Mrs. Weasley," Fleur said, her voice perfectly polished. "Thank you for aving us. I brought dessert. It is a—" "How lovely," Molly interrupted, already turning back toward the kitchen. "Just set it anywhere. We've got plenty of food. I've made your favorite, Bill. Shepherd's pie with extra gravy. And there's treacle tart for after. But I'm sure whatever you've brought will be nice too." The words were perfectly pleasant. The subtext was deafening. Bill felt Fleur's hesitation, saw her arms tighten fractionally around the box. He placed his hand on the small of her back, a gentle reminder that he was there, that they were a team, that she wasn't facing this alone. They stepped into the Burrows' kitchen, and Bill was immediately engulfed in sensation. The room was too small for the number of people in it, too warm from the stove, too bright with evening sun streaming through windows that overlooked the garden. Every surface was covered. Ingredients, dishes, newspapers, what appeared to be Ron's Aura training manuals, a box of Weasley's Wizard Wheezes products that George had been demonstrating at lunch and forgotten to clear away. Ron stood by the sink, attempting to vanish flour from the floor, with limited success. He looked up as they entered and grinned, his ears going slightly red, in the way they always did when he was embarrassed. "Hey, sorry about the mess. George's fault." "Is not," George protested from somewhere near the stove. "Is too," Fred chimed in, materializing from what Bill realized was the pantry. "I'm the innocent one this time. Was nowhere near the kitchen when it happened." "You were literally standing next to me," George said. "Prove it." Arthur Weasley sat at the kitchen table, which had been extended with magic and several mismatched chairs added to accommodate the family. He was sorting through a collection of Muggle batteries, AAs, AAAs, a 9-volt, and what looked like something from a car, with the focused intensity of a man examining precious artifacts. He glanced up at their entrance, and his face broke into a genuine, uncomplicated smile. "Bill, Fleur, wonderful to see you both." Arthur stood, setting down a battery with visible reluctance, and crossed the kitchen to shake Bill's hand and kiss Fleur's cheek in the continental style she'd taught him at the wedding. "How's Gringotts treating you? Still working with the Egyptian accounts?" "When the goblins let me near them," Bill said, grateful for his father's easy manner. "They're still not happy about the break-in. Griphook's defection didn't help matters." "Can't say I blame them," Arthur said seriously. "Security breach like that must be a nightmare for trust building." He turned to Fleur with genuine interest. "And how are you finding the work? Bill mentioned you were helping with the French ministry liaison matters." Fleur's shoulders relaxed infinitesimally. "It is challenging," she admitted. "The goblins, they do not trust easily, and my English, it is still not." "Your English is excellent," Arthur said firmly. "Better than my French, certainly. Though that's not saying much. I can order coffee and ask for directions to the lavatory, and that's about the limit of it." Fleur's laugh was surprised and genuine. "That is more than many English wizards, I think." "Come, sit down." Arthur gestured toward the table. "Dinner's nearly ready, according to Molly, though I've learned that nearly ready can mean anything from 5 minutes to an hour depending on what goes wrong. Nothing's going wrong, Molly called from the stove, where she was stirring something in a large cauldron with rather more force than seemed strictly necessary. Everything's perfectly fine, under control. Fleur, you can put that box wherever. The table's full, maybe the counter, or somewhere. Fleur looked at the kitchen counter, which was indeed covered with dishes, ingredients, and what appeared to be George's experimental swamp jar, now empty and slightly smoking. There was perhaps a 3-inch gap between a bowl of potatoes and a stack of plates. I can hold it, Fleur said, quietly. Don't be silly. Ginny's voice came from the doorway. Bill's sister leaned against the frame, her arms crossed, her expression neutral in a way that Bill recognized as dangerous. She'd grown during the war. Not just older but harder, her edges sharper. She'd fought in the Battle of Hogwarts, had watched friends die, had killed Death Eaters in defense of her school. The girl who'd had a crush on Harry Potter seemed very far away from the young woman who regarded Fleur now with cool assessment. Ginny, Bill said, his voice carrying a warning. What? I'm just saying, we can make room. Ginny pushed off from the doorframe and crossed to the counter, vanishing George's jar with a flick of her wand and pushing the plates aside. There, problem solved. Let me see what you brought. Fleur hesitated, then set the box down and carefully removed the preservation charm. The smell of caramelized apples and buttery pastry filled the kitchen, rich and sweet and unmistakably French. It's a tarte tatin, Fleur explained, her accent curling around the words. My grand-mère's recipe. The apples, they are cooked in the caramel first. Then you put the pastry on top and flip it when it is done. So the fruit is. Looks fancy, Ginny said, her tone unreadable. It's beautiful, Arthur said quickly, leaning over to examine it. Look at that, Molly. The apples are arranged in a perfect spiral. Molly glanced over from the stove, her wooden spoon dripping gravy. Very nice. I'm sure it'll be lovely after dinner. The emphasis on after was subtle but present, a reminder that this was Molly's kitchen, Molly's domain, Molly's family dinner. Bill saw Fleur's jaw tighten, saw her hands clasped together in front of her. Another nervous gesture she probably didn't realize she was doing. He moved to her side, his presence a quiet statement of alliance. Right then, Arthur said with determined cheerfulness. Who wants to help me set the table? Ron, you and Ginny can get the plates. George, Fred, stop whatever you're about to do and fetch the cutlery. Bill, Fleur, sit down. Your guests. We are family, Fleur said softly, but Bill heard the question in it. Arthur met her eyes, and his smile was kind. Exactly. Family, which means you get to sit down and relax while the rest of us do the work. House rules, established 1968, enforced ever since. As the kitchen erupted into motion, Ron accidentally summoning the wrong plates, Fred and George arguing about whether forks went on the left or right. Who cares? We're not the queen. Mum cares, you numpty. Ginny silently distributing glasses with efficient precision. Bill guided Fleur to a chair near his father. She sat down carefully, her posture perfect, her hands folded in her lap. Bill took the seat beside her, their knees touching beneath the table. Through the window, the sun continued its slow descent, painting the garden in darkening gold. The gnome who'd wedged himself under the shed had apparently decided it was safe to emerge, and was eyeing Molly's cabbages with renewed interest. Inside the Burrow's crooked kitchen, with the scent of shepherd's pie and caramelized apples mingling in the warm air, two families prepared to become one. It was going to be, Bill thought, an interesting evening. Dinner was announced with characteristic Weasley efficiency, which is to say, Molly banished everyone from the kitchen except those actively serving food, resulting in a bottleneck at the doorway as 6 grown wizards tried to navigate the space with plates, bowls, and a gravy boat that George swore hadn't been sentient 5 minutes ago. "It winked at me," George insisted, holding the offending object at arm's length. "Gravy boats don't wink," Ron said, though he eyed it warily. "This one did, right eye, very deliberate." "Both of you, sit down," Molly commanded, wielding her wand like a conductor's baton. The shepherd's pie floated past Bill's ear with a scent that made his stomach growl. Beef and vegetables, and that perfect golden crust his mother somehow achieved every time. Behind it came roasted potatoes, buttered carrots, peas that actually looked appetizing rather than the grey mush served at Hogwarts, and a basket of bread rolls that were still steaming. The table, even extended, was a tight fit. Bill found himself wedged between Fleur and Charlie, who'd arrived while they were setting places and immediately launched into a story about a Norwegian ridgeback that had developed an inexplicable fondness for opera music. Across from them, Ron and Hermione, when had she arrived, were attempting to fit their chairs in a space that comfortably accommodated 1.5 people at most. "Budge up," Ginny told George, elbowing him in the ribs. "I'm already halfway onto Fred's lap." "Should have got here earlier," Fred said unsympathetically. "Prime seating goes to the punctual." "You literally live here." Fleur sat perfectly still amid the chaos, her hands folded in her lap, her expression pleasant and fixed. Bill recognized it as the face she wore when dealing with particularly difficult goblins, polite, professional, revealing nothing of the anxiety he knew was churning beneath the surface. Under the table, he found her hand and squeezed it gently. Molly took her place at the head of the table, surveying her family with the satisfaction of a general viewing successful troop deployment. Arthur sat at the opposite end, already reaching for the serving spoons with barely restrained enthusiasm. "Right then," Molly said, picking up her fork in what was clearly a signal. "Let's eat before it gets cold. Help yourselves. There's plenty. Fleur, dear, do you eat beef? I should have asked. I didn't even think." "I eat everything," Fleur assured her quickly. "It smells wonderful, Mrs. Weasley." "Molly, please, you're family now." The words were right, but something in Molly's tone suggested she was still convincing herself of that fact. "Though I suppose you're used to much fancier fare, French cuisine and all that." "My maman, she makes the shepherd's pie too," Fleur said carefully, "though we call it hachis parmentier. It is very similar, I think. Comfort food, yes?" "Exactly that," Arthur said warmly, serving himself a generous portion. "Comfort food, nothing fancy, just good honest cooking. Your mother sounds like a wise woman, Fleur." The food began its circuit around the table, plates being loaded with portions that would have fed a small army. Bill watched Fleur accept servings of everything, her plate filling with the kind of meal he knew was heavier than what she typically ate. She didn't hesitate, though, didn't make a fuss. She was trying, he realized, with a surge of affection, to fit in, "So, Hermione," Charlie said, around a mouthful of potato, "Ron says you're starting at the Ministry next month. Department for the Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures?" Hermione's face lit up with the enthusiasm that had once been reserved for new library books. "Yes. Well, technically, it's a probationary position, but Minister Shacklebolt promised that if I can demonstrate the need for reform, which I absolutely can, the current legislation regarding house elves alone is practically medieval, then I'll be able to establish a new department entirely, the Department for Magical Creature Rights and Welfare. We're still working on the name. Ron thinks it's too long." "It's a mouthful," Ron said, but his expression was fond. "Could just call it the Department of Hermione being right about everything." "That's even longer, you git." Bill smiled at the easy banter, the way his youngest brother and his girlfriend, he'd lost track of their status, fell into comfortable rhythm. Across the table, he caught Ginny rolling her eyes with the long, suffering air of someone who'd been listening to this particular argument for weeks. "What about you, Fleur?" Hermione asked, turning her attention with genuine interest. "Bill mentioned you're doing liaison work between Gringotts and the French Ministry." Fleur seemed surprised to be addressed directly, to be included in the conversation rather than observed from its edges. Yes. The goblins. They have accounts with many international clients, and after the war, after the complications, they need someone who can speak both languages, not just French and English, but goblin and wizard. You understand? The trust, it is very delicate now." "That must be incredibly challenging," Hermione said, leaning forward, "especially given the cultural differences in how goblins view ownership and property rights. I've been reading about it. Did you know that in goblin culture, when you purchase something made by goblin hands, you're really only purchasing the right to use it during your lifetime? The object itself still belongs to the maker and their clan." Fleur finished, nodding. "Yes, exactly. This is why they were so upset about the sword of Gryffindor. It was not just about the sword itself, but about the principle. A goblin-made artifact taken by wizards passed down through wizard families as though it belonged to them. For the goblins, this is theft, not inheritance." Hermione's eyes widened. "Exactly. I've been trying to explain this well, it doesn't matter, but you understand it. Do you think there's any chance of reconciliation? Real reconciliation, I mean, not just the political kind?" "It will take time," Fleur said slowly. Bill could see her relaxing slightly, her passion for the work overriding her nervousness. "Many years, I think. The goblins, they have long memories. But there are some. Ragnarok, the one I work with most. He's willing to try. He says the war showed that wizards and goblins both bleed, both die, both lose what they love. Perhaps that is enough to build on." "That's remarkably progressive for a goblin," Arthur said, looking impressed. "Ragnarok, you said. I met him once, years ago, when I was investigating a case of enchanted muggle coins. Prickly fellow, but fair." "He is very fair," Fleur agreed. "Also very prickly." The table laughed, and Bill felt some of the tension ease. This was going well, he thought, better than he'd feared. Fleur was holding her own, engaging with his family, showing them the intelligence and competence he knew she possessed, but that sometimes got lost behind her appearance. Then Molly noticed that serving bowls were emptying. "Oh!" She stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the stone floor. We need more potatoes, and the gravy's running low. Let me help, Fleur said immediately, already rising from her seat. Bill saw his mother's hesitation, the brief calculation behind her eyes, but refusing would be rude, and Molly Weasley was many things, but rarely intentionally rude. That's very kind, dear, Molly said. The potatoes are in the warming oven, and there's more gravy in the pot on the stove. Just needs stirring. Fleur moved toward the kitchen with the grace that characterized everything she did, her movements fluid and elegant even in the cramped space. Bill started to rise, to follow and offer support, but Charlie's hand on his arm stopped him. Let her, Charlie murmured. She's trying to prove something. To Mum, maybe to herself. Bill subsided, though his attention remained fixed on the kitchen doorway. He heard the clatter of pottery, the soft hum of the warming oven opening, his mother's voice offering instructions. So, Bill, Fred said, with the particular tone that meant he was about to be an arse, how's married life treating you? Getting enough sleep? You look tired, very tired, exhausted even. Shut up, Bill said mildly. I'm just concerned, as your brother, about your well-being. Your concern is noted and ignored. George snickered into his water glass. He's dodging the question. That's basically a confession. I will hex you, Bill threatened. Both of you. Something painful and embarrassing. Charlie, you're a witness. I gave fair warning. Leave him alone, Ginny said. But she was smiling. Some of us are eating. In the kitchen, Fleur had retrieved the potatoes and was now standing at the stove, examining the gravy pot. Molly hovered nearby, not quite supervising, but not quite absent either. Through the doorway, Bill watched his wife pick up the wooden spoon and give the gravy an experimental stir. It's thick enough, I think, Fleur said, glancing at Molly. In France, we sometimes add a touch of wine to the gravy. Red wine, just a splash. It gives a richness, a depth. Would you like me to? This is how we make gravy in this family, Molly said, her voice polite but firm. It's Arthur's favorite. Been making it this way for 30 years. Of course, Fleur said quickly. I did not mean it is perfect as it is. Bill winced. He could hear the slight strain in Fleur's voice, see the tension creeping back into her shoulders. She was trying so hard, and every attempt seemed to land wrong, to be interpreted as criticism rather than contribution. Fleur lifted the pot to carry it back to the table. It was heavy, Bill knew, cast iron and nearly full. She held it carefully in both hands, moving slowly to avoid spilling. Perhaps a levitation charm would be easier, Molly suggested, reaching for her wand. I have it, Fleur assured her. It is not so. She never finished the sentence. Later, Bill would try to reconstruct exactly what happened. He thought Fleur had been reaching for her wand with one hand while holding the pot with the other. Or perhaps she'd attempted a wandless levitation charm, which required precision and focus that nervousness undermined. Or maybe she'd simply misjudged the pot's weight, the distribution of liquid inside it. Whatever the cause, the result was spectacular. The pot tipped. Gravy arced through the air in a perfect parabola, defying several laws of physics in the way that magical accidents often did. It splattered across the kitchen ceiling in an impressive radius, droplets raining down like a savory storm. Some landed on the floor, some hit the counter. A significant portion hit Molly. The kitchen froze. Molly stood absolutely still, gravy dripping from her hair, her nose, her apron. She looked like she'd been caught in a very specific, very brown rainstorm. Fleur's face drained of color. Oh no, I'm so sorry. I did not mean, Mrs. Weasley, It's fine, Molly said, but her voice was tight, controlled in a way that suggested it was very much not fine. Accidents happen. Let me help. I can clean. Fleur raised her wand, her hand shaking. I'll do it, Molly said, already casting a cleaning charm that removed the gravy from her person with rather more force than strictly necessary. You should sit down. Go on, before something else happens. The words hung in the air like an accusation. Bill was on his feet before he'd consciously decided to move, crossing to the kitchen doorway. It was an accident, Mum. Could have happened to anyone. Remember when Ron dropped the entire Christmas turkey? I was 10, Ron protested from the table. And I dropped Aunt Muriel's prized teapot when I was 12, Ginny added, her voice carrying clearly. Smithereens. Never heard the end of it. I set the curtains on fire trying to show off a new spell, Fred contributed. That was me, George corrected. You're the one who turned Percy's hair orange for a month. Oh, right. Good times. Despite the attempts at levity, Fleur's expression remained stricken. She stared at the ceiling, where gravy still dripped from the beams, despite Molly's cleaning charms, each drop a small accusation. Her hands twisted together, and Bill could see her fighting back tears. I should not have, Fleur's voice cracked. I only wanted to help. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Molly's expression flickered, something softening in her eyes as she registered Fleur's genuine distress. But before she could respond, Arthur appeared in the doorway, taking in the scene with the practiced eye of someone who'd weathered many domestic disasters. Right, he said calmly. Molly, why don't you sit down? I'll finish the cleaning charms. You know, I enjoy a good spell challenge. Bill, help me with this ceiling. Fleur, dear, could you bring those potatoes through? I think we're all still hungry. It was a diplomatic extraction, removing Fleur from the scene of the accident, while giving Molly space to collect herself and Bill something constructive to do with his hands, rather than something destructive with his wand toward his mother. Fleur picked up the bowl of potatoes with exaggerated care, holding it as though it contained nitroglycerin. She moved back to the table in silence, set the bowl down precisely in its previous location, and sat down. She did not look at anyone. Bill remained in the kitchen, helping his father vanish the remaining gravy spots. On the ceiling, a particularly stubborn patch seemed determined to resist all cleaning charms, spreading instead into the shape that looked disconcertingly like a grim. Not her fault, Bill said, quietly, his jaw tight. I know that, Arthur replied, equally quiet. Your mother knows it too. Give her time, son. This isn't really about gravy. Then what is it about? Arthur was silent for a moment, carefully vanishing the grim-shaped stain. When you have 7 children, your kitchen is your kingdom. Your table is where you show love. And when someone new comes in, someone who seems perfect and accomplished and frankly intimidating, someone who might make different gravy or arrange apples in spirals. He glanced at Bill. It's not rational, but feelings rarely are. She's trying so hard, Dad. I know, I can see that. Your mother will see it too eventually. Just give them both some grace. Change is hard, even when it's good. They returned to the table, where an uncomfortable silence had settled like fog. Plates were being filled with potatoes in careful quiet. Hermione was determinedly talking about something related to werewolf legislation. Ron was nodding along with the enthusiasm of someone who wasn't really listening, but loved the person talking. Fleur sat perfectly still, her food untouched, her face composed into a mask of polite emptiness that Bill hated. It was the face she wore at Gringotts when the goblins said something particularly insulting. The face that meant she was retreating into herself, building walls. Molly emerged from the kitchen, her hair damp from cleaning charms, but otherwise composed. She sat down at the head of the table, picked up her fork, and took a deliberate bite of shepherd's pie. "Bit cold now," she observed to no one in particular. "Should have eaten it while it was hot." The rebuke, however mild, was clear. Bill felt Fleur flinch beside him, a movement so slight that anyone not touching her wouldn't have noticed. But he was touching her, their knees still pressed together beneath the table, a point of contact and solidarity. Ginny, watching this with sharp eyes, deliberately turned to Fleur. "You said you work with Ragnarok. I've heard he's the best curse breaker the goblins have. Supposedly, he worked on some of the deepest vaults, the ones with the really nasty protections. Is it true he once survived a flagranti curse and the Gemino curse triggering simultaneously?" It was a lifeline, and Fleur grabbed it. "He survived, yes," she said, her voice still quiet but steadier. Though he says surviving is perhaps too strong a word. He still has nightmares about it, and he will not go near anything gold and shiny for longer than necessary. The burns, they took months to heal, and the copies." She shuddered delicately. Thousands of copies, all cursed, all burning. Bill has stories too, from Egypt. Tell them about the tomb with the scarabs, Bill. The one that... And just like that, conversation began to flow again. Bill launched into the story of the cursed scarab tomb, embellishing slightly for effect, and felt the table begin to relax. Charlie added his own near-death experience with a Hungarian horn tale. Fred and George contributed a tale about a prototype that had gone so spectacularly wrong, they'd had to evacuate Diagon Alley. Gradually, plates emptied. Hermione successfully diverted Molly into a discussion about house elf welfare that seemed to genuinely interest his mother, rather than offend her. Arthur showed Ron a particularly interesting D battery he'd acquired, which apparently came from a Muggle device called a remote control. Through it all, Fleur remained quieter than usual, participating when directly addressed, but otherwise retreating into observation. She ate her shepherd's pie. Bill noticed she cleaned her plate completely, as though to prove something, and she smiled at appropriate moments and laughed softly when Charlie did a surprisingly accurate impression of his Romanian supervisor. But something had been lost in the kitchen, some confidence or hope, and Bill didn't know how to give it back to her. As the last bites were finished and plates were being cleared, George suddenly stood, raising his water glass with theatrical flair. "A toast," he announced, "to family dinners, where everything that can go wrong does go wrong, and we eat it anyway." "Hear, hear," Fred agreed, standing as well. "To gravy on the ceiling, a noble Weasley tradition." "To destruction and chaos," Charlie added, grinning. "To coming home," Bill said, quietly, looking at Fleur, trying to will her to understand that home wasn't perfect, that family was messy and complicated and sometimes hurt even when it meant well. Fleur met his eyes, and he saw the sadness there, the doubt. But she raised her glass with the others. Molly, watching from the head of the table, said nothing. But her expression had shifted into something more thoughtful, less defensive. It was, Bill thought, as glasses clinked together, a start, even if it was a messy one. The clearing of dishes was accomplished with the practiced efficiency of a family that had been doing this particular dance for decades. Plates floated toward the kitchen in neat stacks. Glasses followed in formation, and cutlery marched along behind like a small, clinking army. Fred had enchanted the water to wash dishes on its own years ago, a spell that Molly claimed to disapprove of but had never actually undone. And the resulting splashing and clattering from the kitchen provided a comfortable backdrop to conversation. Bill watched Fleur reach for her water glass, then change her mind. She folded her hands in her lap instead, her posture still perfect, still rigid. The gravy incident had shaken something in her, and he could see her withdrawing, pulling back into herself the way she had in those first weeks at Shell Cottage after the escape from Malfoy Manor. Back then, she'd moved through the cottage like a ghost, speaking only when spoken to, as though afraid that taking up too much space might somehow be the thing that tipped the scales toward disaster. He'd thought they were past that, but sitting at his family's table, surrounded by the easy chaos of Weasley life, he watched his wife become small and quiet, and it made something ache in his chest. "Right then," Molly said, standing and smoothing her apron with a decisive motion. "Dessert. Let's see what we've got, shall we?" It wasn't really a question. Molly moved toward the kitchen with purpose, and Bill knew what she was doing, reasserting control over her domain, reminding everyone that this was still her table, her dinner, her family. It wasn't cruel, exactly, but it wasn't kind either. "Mum's treacle tart is legendary," Ron told Hermione, who had apparently somehow never experienced this particular Weasley tradition. "Seriously, it's worth every other disaster that happens at these dinners." "I believe you've mentioned it," Hermione said, dryly. "Approximately 47 times since we left London." 47 is a conservative estimate, Ginny muttered. Molly returned, carrying a large rectangular dish, the treacle tart, golden and perfect, its lattice top glistening in the warm kitchen light. The smell was intoxicating, sweet and rich, with undertones of lemon and breadcrumbs, and that indefinable something that made it taste like home and childhood and everything good. She set it in the center of the table with visible pride, and rightfully so. It was a masterpiece. "Now that," Arthur said admiringly, "is a work of art, Molly. Outdone yourself this time." "It's just treacle tart, Arthur. I've been making it for 30 years. Hardly complicated." But Molly's cheeks flushed with pleasure, and she began cutting generous slices with practiced efficiency. Fleur shifted slightly beside Bill, and he realized she was looking at her tart tatin, still sitting on the counter where she'd placed it before dinner. In the warm glow of the kitchen, the caramelized apples gleamed, their spiral arrangement as perfect as it had been that morning when she'd finally been satisfied with her work. No one had mentioned it. Bill saw the moment Fleur made her decision, saw her spine straighten fractionally and her chin lift. She was gathering courage, he realized, for something that shouldn't require courage at all. "Mrs. Weasley," Fleur said, her voice carefully modulated, accent softening the consonants. "Perhaps we could have both. The treacle tart and the—" "I think one dessert is quite enough," Molly interrupted, not unkindly but firmly. "We're all quite full from dinner." don't want to overdo it. Your tart looks lovely, dear, but maybe we can save it for later. Or you can take it home. I'm sure it'll keep." The words were practical, reasonable even, but underneath them was a message that everyone at the table understood. This is my kitchen. These are my family traditions. You don't get to come in and change things just because you married my son. Bill felt his temper flare, hot and immediate. "Actually, I'd quite like to try Fleur's tart. She spent hours on it this morning, 3 attempts before she was satisfied with the caramelization." "I'm sure it's lovely, Bill, but I want some too," Ginny said. And there was something in her voice that made Bill glance at her sharply. His sister was watching Fleur with an expression he couldn't quite read. Assessment, perhaps, or the beginning of something like understanding. "I've never had tart tatin. Seems like a waste not to try it when it's right there." "Me too," Hermione added quickly. "If that's all right. I mean, both would be wonderful. We don't have to choose, surely." Molly's mouth tightened. For a moment, Bill thought she might dig in, might insist on treacle tart alone, might make this the hill she chose to die on. But Arthur cleared his throat gently. "Both sounds perfect," Arthur said, his tone mild, but carrying an undercurrent of finality. "We're a big family, plenty of room for 2 desserts. Variety is the spice of life, as the Muggles say. Or is it the spice of wives? I can never remember. Anyway, both. Brilliant idea." Molly's expression flickered. Irritation, resignation, and then something that might have been shame. "Of course," she said, her voice clipped. "Both. Why not? Fleur, if you'd like to bring it over." Fleur rose from her seat with careful grace, moving toward the counter where her dessert waited. Bill started to stand as well, instinctively wanting to help, to support, to somehow make this easier. But Charlie's hand landed on his shoulder again, holding him in place. "Let her," Charlie murmured again. "She needs to do this herself." Fleur lifted the tarte tatin carefully, cradling it in both hands. It was heavier than it looked. Bill knew because he'd watched her make it, watched her test the weight and adjust her grip multiple times in their kitchen. The dish was warm from the preservation charm, and the caramel was still slightly soft, which meant it needed to be carried with particular care to avoid sliding. She turned toward the table, navigating the narrow space between counter and chairs. 3 steps. That was all it would take. 3 careful steps, and she could set it down, could offer this piece of herself, this connection to her grandmother and her childhood and her heritage, to his family. 2 steps. Ron was reaching for the treacle tart, his arm extended across the table in that careless way he had, taking up space without thinking about it, because he'd never had to think about it. This was his home and his table, and he belonged here without question. His elbow caught the edge of a serving platter, the one that had held the roasted potatoes, now empty and sitting halfway off the edge of the table because no one had bothered to move it properly. The platter tilted. Fleur, focused on her own careful progress, didn't see it. Her hip brushed against its edge as she passed. The platter fell. Fleur instinctively tried to catch it. A reflex, automatic, thoughtless. She shifted her weight, reached out with one hand. The tarte tatin slipped. Bill saw it happening as though time had slowed, each moment stretching into painful clarity. He saw Fleur's eyes widen in horror, saw her try to correct, to regain her grip, saw the dish tilt too far, the caramel-coated apples beginning their slide toward disaster. She managed to catch it, just barely. The dish rocked precariously in her hands, one edge lower than the other, but she caught it. The serving platter, however, continued its fall. It hit the floor with a sound like a gunshot. Not the floor, Bill's mind corrected numbly. The china plate. The one sitting on the floor because Ginny had set it down there earlier when clearing space. The one with the delicate blue pattern that had been Aunt Muriel's before she'd given it to Molly years ago. The one that Molly had told stories about, how it had survived the First War, how she'd hidden it during Death Eater raids, how it reminded her of better times. The platter hit the plate dead center. For a single, frozen heartbeat. Nothing happened. Then the plate shattered. Not cracked, not chipped, shattered. Blue china shards exploded outward like shrapnel, skittering across the stone floor in 100 directions at once. The largest piece was perhaps the size of a galleon. Most were smaller. Some were barely visible fragments, glittering dust catching the light. The silence that followed was absolute. Fleur stood frozen, the tarte tatin still clutched in her hands, her face drained of all color. She stared down at the wreckage on the floor, at the impossible destruction of something irreplaceable, and Bill saw her throat work as she tried to swallow. Her voice came out as barely a whisper. Je suis désolée. I am so sorry. I did not see. I did not mean. She switched to French, words tumbling out in a rapid cascade that Bill barely caught. Apologies and horror and self-recrimination, a litany of guilt and shame. She was shaking, he realized, actually trembling, hard enough that the tarte tatin wobbled dangerously in her grip. It's just a plate, Ginny said quickly, but her voice lacked conviction. Everyone at the table knew it wasn't just a plate. Molly stood slowly, moving around the table toward the shattered china. She knelt down, picking up the largest piece, a curved shard that still showed part of the pattern, delicate flowers and vines rendered in blue and white. She held it carefully, as though it might still somehow be made whole through gentle handling. "Mum," Bill said, his own voice rough. It was an accident. Ron's elbow. The platter was unstable. It could have happened to anyone. "Sorry," Ron muttered, looking stricken. "I didn't mean. I was just reaching for—" "It is my fault," Fleur interrupted, her English fracturing under stress. "I should have been more careful. I should have seen. I am so clumsy, so stupid. I ruin everything I touch. I should not have—" "Fleur." Bill was on his feet, moving toward her. "Love, it's not—" "It is." Her voice cracked, and tears, the ones she'd been fighting all evening, finally spilled over, tracking down her cheeks in silver lines. "The gravy, the plate, everything I do tonight is wrong. Everything is disaster. I cannot even walk across a room without destroying something precious, something that matters. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." She was spiraling, Bill realized with alarm. Not just upset, but genuinely distraught. That particular combination of shame and frustration and overwhelming inadequacy that he'd only seen a handful of times, usually after something had gone truly, catastrophically wrong at Gringotts. "Let me help clean up," Fleur said desperately, trying to set down the tarte tatin on the nearest surface, which happened to be a stack of napkins, completely unstable. "Let me fix it, I can. There are charms, repair charms. I can just stop." Molly's voice cut through Fleur's panic like a knife. Not loud, but firm, final. "Just stop helping, please." The word "please" didn't soften the blow. If anything, it made it worse. Polite, restrained devastation. Fleur flinched as though she'd been struck. The tarte tatin wobbled dangerously on its napkin perch. Bill lunged forward and caught it just before it joined the plate in destruction, setting it safely on the counter with more force than necessary. "That's enough, Mum," he said, and his voice came out harder than he'd intended. Hard enough that several people at the table shifted uncomfortably. "Bill," Arthur started, his tone warning. "No, Dad, that's enough." Bill turned to face his mother, and the anger he'd been suppressing all evening, the frustration at her cool politeness, her subtle digs, her refusal to make even the smallest effort to welcome Fleur properly, finally broke free. "She's been trying all night, trying to help, trying to fit in, trying to be part of this family. And all you've done is—" "I haven't done anything," Molly said, but her voice was rising now too, color flooding into her cheeks. "I invited you both to dinner. I cooked. I was perfectly civil. If she's clumsy, if she can't manage to cross a room without destroying things, that's hardly my fault. It was an accident. Everything tonight has been an accident, apparently. The gravy was an accident. The plate was an accident. Maybe—" Molly stopped herself, but not quickly enough. "Maybe what?" Bill demanded. "Maybe she's the accident? Maybe she doesn't belong here?" "I didn't say that. You didn't have to." The table had gone dead silent. Even Fred and George, usually ready with a quip to diffuse tension, sat frozen. Hermione was staring at her hands. Ron looked like he wanted to disappear into his chair. Charlie was watching with the careful neutrality of someone trying very hard not to take sides. Only Ginny was looking at Fleur, and her expression had shifted into something Bill couldn't quite read. Not anger, not satisfaction at seeing someone else struggle. Something softer, something like recognition. Fleur had wrapped her arms around herself, still standing by the counter, tears still falling silently down her face. She looked devastated, small, utterly defeated. "I should go," she whispered. "I should not have come. This was a mistake." "You're not going anywhere," Bill said firmly, turning to her. "This is my family, and you're my wife, and you belong here just as much as anyone else at this table." "Bill," Fleur's voice was thick with tears. "Please, I do not want to make more trouble. Your maman is right. I am clumsy. "You are nervous," Arthur said quietly, and everyone's attention snapped to him. He was still sitting at the head of the table, but his expression had shifted from mild observation to something more serious, more intent. "You're nervous, and you're trying too hard. And accidents happen when people are nervous and trying too hard. I should know. I once set fire to Molly's parents' garden shed during our first family dinner together. Tried to impress her father with a Muggle artifact I'd been studying. It exploded. Took 3 wizards and a Muggle fire brigade to put it out." "Arthur," Molly said, but her voice had lost some of its edge. "It's true. You were mortified. Your mother wouldn't speak to me for a month. Thought I was a disaster waiting to happen. Reckless, irresponsible, certainly not good enough for her daughter." Arthur looked at Molly steadily. "But you defended me. You told them that accidents don't define people, that what matters is intention and effort and whether someone is trying to do better." The silence that followed this was different, heavier, weighted with implication. Molly stood very still, still holding the piece of shattered plate, and something was working behind her eyes, some calculation or realization or memory that Bill couldn't quite see. I remember that shed, she said finally, her voice quieter. Mother was furious, said you'd never be welcome in her home again. But you brought me back anyway, Arthur said gently. You made them see past the disaster to the man who was trying so hard to make a good impression that he'd accidentally committed arson. That was different. Was it? Molly's mouth opened, then closed. She looked down at the shard of china in her hand, then at the mess on the floor, then, finally, at Fleur. Fleur, who was still wrapped in her own arms, still crying silently, still looking like she wanted nothing more than to disapparate away and never come back. Her silvery hair was slightly disheveled. Her robes, carefully chosen that morning, Bill knew, changed 3 times before she'd been satisfied, had a small gravy stain on the sleeve that the cleaning charm had missed. She looked young, Bill thought suddenly, young and scared and desperately out of her depth. She looked, he realized with a jolt, exactly how his mother must have looked at her own first family dinner, trying to impress her in-laws, terrified of making a mistake. Molly seemed to arrive at the same realization. Bill watched his mother's expression shift, the anger draining away, replaced by something complicated and uncomfortable that might have been recognition or guilt or simple human empathy, finally breaking through layers of resentment and worry. Oh, Molly said softly. Just that. Oh. She set down the piece of plate carefully, then pulled her wand from her apron pocket. Reparo. The shards of china rose from the floor like birds taking flight, swirling through the air in a spiral pattern before coming together. Cracks sealed themselves. Fragments found their homes. In seconds, the plate was whole again, the blue pattern complete, as though it had never been broken at all. Molly caught it as it settled, examined it briefly to ensure the repair was complete, then set it safely on the table. Then she did something Bill had not expected. She crossed to Fleur, moving slowly, carefully, as though approaching something fragile that might bolt. She stopped just in front of his wife, and for a long moment, neither of them moved. I'm sorry, Molly said, and her voice cracked slightly on the words. I have been unfair, unkind even. Not intentionally, perhaps, but intent matters less than impact, doesn't it? She took a shaky breath. You've been trying all evening to fit in, to help, to be part of this family. And I've been making it difficult, making you feel unwelcome in what should be your home too. Fleur stared at her, eyes wide and uncertain, as though she couldn't quite believe what she was hearing. I was frightened, Molly continued, and now her own eyes were bright with tears, of losing my son, of him choosing a life I couldn't understand, a person I couldn't predict. You're so beautiful, so accomplished, so not what I imagined. And I let that fear make me small, make me unkind. I'm sorry. For a long moment, Fleur didn't respond. Then, slowly, she unwrapped her arms from around herself. Her hands were shaking as she reached up to wipe her tears away. I understand fear, she said quietly. I've been afraid all evening, afraid of not being good enough, of not belonging, of proving that all the doubts were right. She managed a watery smile. We are both afraid, I think. But maybe we do not have to be. Molly let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. Then, moving carefully as though afraid of being rejected, she reached out and took Fleur's hand. It was a small gesture, simple, but at the Burrow's crowded table, with 6 grown Weasleys watching, and the smell of treacle tart and caramelized apples mingling in the warm air, it felt momentous. Fleur's fingers closed around Molly's, holding tight. "I would very much like to try," Fleur whispered. "To belong here, if you will let me." "I'd like that too," Molly said, then stronger. "We'll both try, together, and we'll probably both make more mistakes because that's what families do. But we'll try." At the table, George cleared his throat loudly. "Right. Well, this is all very touching, and I'm definitely not crying. That's just dust in my eye. But can we please eat some bloody dessert now? I'm starving." "Language," Molly said automatically, but she was laughing through her tears. "Seconded," Fred said. "Emotional resolution is grand and all, but I was promised French pastry, and I intend to collect." The tension shattered like the plate had, but this time the breaking was relief rather than disaster. Bill felt something unknot in his chest, something he hadn't realized was wound so tight. Ginny stood, grabbed a knife, and began cutting the tart tatin with decisive efficiency. "Right, both desserts. Everyone gets some of each. No arguing." "No one was arguing," Ron protested. "Shut up and pass plates." As dessert was distributed, generous slices of treacle tart alongside smaller portions of tart tatin, conversation began to flow again, tentative at first, and then more naturally. Arthur declared the French dessert absolutely brilliant. That caramel is something else entirely. Hermione asked for the recipe. Fred and George argued about which dessert was superior before deciding they needed to conduct further experiments and requesting seconds. Molly and Fleur sat down side by side at the corner of the table, their hands still linked, and began a halting conversation about family recipes and cooking disasters and the particular challenges of feeding 7 children who all thought they were starving at any given moment. Bill caught his father's eye across the table, and Arthur gave him a small nod, acknowledgement, approval, relief. It wasn't perfect. There would be more awkward moments, more misunderstandings, more times when fear and resentment would rear their heads. Families were complicated, blending 2 worlds, French and British, old and new, established patterns and unfamiliar traditions, would never be smooth. But as Bill watched his mother laugh at something Fleur said, watched his wife's shoulders finally truly relax, watched his family pass desserts and argue good-naturedly about whether French or British pastry was superior, Charlie declared it a draw, which satisfied no one. He thought maybe they had turned a corner. Maybe, sometimes, things had to break before they could be properly repaired. And maybe the cracks, once healed, made the whole thing stronger. The dual desserts proved to be an unexpected success, though the debate over their relative merits threatened to devolve into the kind of good-natured argument that the Weasley family elevated to an art form. "I'm not saying the treacle tart isn't excellent," Hermione said diplomatically, her fork poised over her plate where she'd carefully sampled both offerings. "I'm just saying that the tart tatin has a complexity of flavor that—" "Complexity is just a fancy word for too many things happening," Ron interrupted, already reaching for a second slice of treacle tart. "Sometimes simple is better. Classic. Traditional." "You're only saying that because you're a creature of habit," Ginny shot back. "You'd eat the same 7 meals on rotation for the rest of your life if Hermione let you." "Nothing wrong with knowing what you like. There's knowing what you like, and then there's being boring. I'm not boring. You literally own 7 identical pairs of brown shoes. They're practical." Bill caught Fleur's eye across the table and saw, for the first time that evening, genuine amusement flickering there. Her tears had dried, though her eyes were still slightly red, and she sat closer to Molly now than she had during dinner. Not quite touching, but near enough that it felt intentional, like the beginnings of a bridge being built. In France, Fleur said quietly, but clearly enough that the conversation paused. My grandmère, she would say that both can be true at once. The simple can be perfect, and the complex can be beautiful, and there is room for both at the table. She was very wise about desserts, and also about life, though she used desserts to explain most things. I like her already, Arthur said warmly. What was her name? Is she still… Marguerite, Fleur said, and something soft and sad crossed her face. She died 2 years before the war ended. She was very old, very tired, but she had a good life, I think. A full life. She taught me to cook, to see magic in ordinary things, like butter and sugar and patience. She sounds wonderful, Molly said, and her voice carried genuine warmth now, the kind that couldn't be faked. The best cooks always are. It's not really about the food, is it? It's about the care that goes into it, the attention, the love. Fleur nodded, swallowing hard. She would make the tarte tatin every Sunday, always the same recipe, but never quite the same because the apples were different, or the weather changed how the caramel set, or her mood that day made her add more cinnamon or less. She said cooking was like life. You could follow all the rules perfectly and still have surprises. Your grandmother, George said solemnly, was clearly a genius. This is the most profound food-related philosophy I've heard since Fred tried to convince Mum that chocolate was a vegetable because cocoa came from beans. That was a sound argument, and I stand by it, Fred insisted. You got sent to your room without dinner. A temporary setback. My theory remains valid. The table laughed, and Bill felt the last of the evening's tension finally dissipate. This was his family at their best. Chaotic, argumentative, but fundamentally warm. Fundamentally kind. Once you got past the walls, and the fear and the fierce protectiveness that sometimes manifested as suspicion. Arthur leaned back in his chair, his plate empty save for a few crumbs, his expression content. You know, Fleur, I've been meaning to ask. Bill mentioned you were at Gringotts during much of the war. That must have been difficult, dangerous even, with so many dark wizards controlling the ministry, trying to access vaults. The shift in conversation was subtle, but deliberate, Bill recognized. His father had a gift for steering discussions, for finding the threads that connected people and pulling them gently to the surface. He'd done it earlier with the gravy incident, and he was doing it now, creating space for Fleur to be seen, to be heard, to be more than the nervous wreck who'd shattered a plate. Fleur set down her fork carefully. It was complicated, she said slowly. The goblins, they do not involve themselves in wizard wars, you understand. They stay neutral. But neutrality is difficult when Death Eaters are demanding access to vaults, when the Muggle-born are having their possessions confiscated, when everything is controlled by fear and violence. How did you manage it? Hermione asked, leaning forward with the intense focus she brought to anything she found intellectually engaging. The goblins are notoriously protective of their independence, having to navigate Death Eater demands while maintaining that autonomy must have required incredible diplomacy. And courage, Arthur added quietly. Fleur's cheeks coloured slightly. I do not know about courage. Mostly it was fear and trying to look calm while being terrified. Bill was away so much on missions for the Order, and I could not help with that, could not fight the way others fought. But I could work. I could be useful at Gringotts. The goblins, they trusted me a little. Not much, but a little, because I spoke their language, because I understood about pride and honour and not bending the knee. You did more than work, Bill said firmly. You warned us about security changes, about Death Eaters trying to access certain vaults, about the Carrows making inquiries about the Lestrange Vault. The Lestrange Vault, Ron said, and his voice carried an odd note. That was, we broke into that one. During the war. It was, he glanced at Hermione, something complicated passing between them. It was important. I heard about that, Fleur said, and there was no judgment in her voice, only curiosity. The goblins, they were furious, betrayed, they said, but also, some of them were impressed, I think, that wizards could be so bold, so clever, though they would never admit it. We had help, Hermione said quietly, from a goblin named Griphook, though the help came at a price, and the ending wasn't. She trailed off, clearly unwilling to elaborate further. An uncomfortable silence settled briefly before Charlie cleared it with a change of subject. What about Shell Cottage? Bill said you stayed there during the worst of it, after he was attacked. That must have been isolating, cut off from everyone, waiting for news. Fleur's expression shifted, becoming distant as she remembered. Shell Cottage was safe, quiet, sometimes too quiet, when Bill was away and there was no news, nothing but the sea and the waiting. But then, she paused, glancing at Ron and Hermione again. Then it became less quiet, more full. We crashed your sanctuary, Ron said, looking uncomfortable. Literally, Dobby apparated us there in the middle of the night. We were a mess, half dead, traumatized. Hermione was. His jaw tightened. We weren't exactly ideal houseguests. You were family, Fleur said simply. You were in danger. You needed help, and we helped. That is what family does, no? Molly, who had been listening quietly while demolishing her slice of tarte tatin, looked up sharply at that. You took them in, all of them, after the Malfoy Manor escape. Of course, Fleur said, seeming surprised by the question. Where else would they go? They could not go to the Burrow. Too dangerous, too obvious. Shell Cottage was protected, hidden. We had a room. We had food. We had bandages and potions and... She stopped herself, clearly not wanting to detail exactly how much bandaging and healing had been required. Hermione was in bad shape, Ginny said quietly, and there was something hard in her voice. Bellatrix tortured her, used the Cruciatus curse, carved into her arm with a cursed knife. The table went very still. I did not know it was that bad, Fleur said softly. I knew it was bad, but... She looked at Hermione with new understanding, new horror. You hid it well. You were so strong. I wasn't strong, Hermione said, her voice tight. I was broken. You and Bill put me back together. You didn't ask questions, didn't push, just helped. Fed us. Let us sleep. Made us feel safe for the first time in months. It was nothing. It was everything. Ron interrupted, his voice rough. You didn't have to do it. You could have turned us away, said it was too dangerous, that you had your own problems. But you didn't. You took care of us like we were yours to take care of. Fleur looked genuinely surprised by this assessment, as though she'd never considered that offering sanctuary during a war might be remarkable rather than simply obvious. "But you are Bill's family," she said, "which makes you my family. Of course I would help." "Not everyone would have," Arthur said, and his voice carried the weight of someone who'd seen too many people turn away from helping during dangerous times, who'd watched neighbors betray neighbors, friends abandon friends. Not everyone would have taken that risk. The Death Eaters were hunting Harry, Ron, and Hermione specifically. Harboring them was dangerous, potentially deadly. "Then it is good I am Gryffindor at Erd, even if the ad put me in Beauxbaton instead," Fleur said with a small smile. "We do not think about danger when people need help. We just help." Molly's hand, Bill noticed, had moved to the table, her fingers drumming against the wood in the way they did when she was thinking hard, processing something that challenged her previous assumptions. She was looking at Fleur differently now, really seeing her, perhaps for the first time. "I didn't know," Molly said slowly. "I didn't know you'd taken them in. Ron never mentioned it, neither did Hermione." "We were all dealing with so much," Hermione said quietly. "And after the war ended, there was so much else to process, so many people to mourn, that the good things sometimes got lost in the grief." "But they shouldn't be lost," Arthur said firmly. "The good things, the kindnesses, the courage, the moments of light in the darkness, those are what we should remember. Those are what matter." He turned to Fleur with genuine respect in his eyes. "You protected my son when he was injured. You sheltered my youngest son and his friends when they were hunted. You worked at Gringotts, risking yourself to gather intelligence that helped the Order. You did all of this while being far from your own family, your own country, your own support systems. That takes extraordinary courage, Fleur." "I was just doing what needed to be done," Fleur protested, clearly uncomfortable with the praise. "Anyone would have—" "No," Molly said, and her voice cut through Fleur's protest with unexpected force. "No, anyone wouldn't have. Most people would have run, would have gone back to France where it was safer, where their family was, where they could pretend the war wasn't their problem. But you stayed, and you fought in your own way, and you—" Molly's voice cracked slightly. "You kept my son alive. You kept my other son safe. And I never thanked you for that. I never even acknowledged it." Tears were threatening again. Bill could see them gathering in Fleur's eyes, could see her fighting to keep her composure. "Mrs. Weasley." "Molly," his mother corrected gently. "Please, Fleur, call me Molly." The use of her first name, offered freely rather than grudgingly, seemed to undo something in Fleur. She nodded, not trusting herself to speak. "I was at Shell Cottage too," Ginny said suddenly, and everyone turned to look at her in surprise. "After the Battle of Hogwarts, when we were identifying bodies, I stayed there for 2 days because I couldn't face coming back to the Burrow, couldn't face Mum and Dad without breaking completely. I showed up at your door at 3 in the morning and you didn't ask questions. You just let me in, made me tea, sat with me while I cried." Fleur looked startled. "That was nothing. You needed—" "You barely knew me," Ginny interrupted. "I'd been awful to you for years. Made snide comments, called you phlegm behind your back, acted like you were this shallow, vain person who didn't deserve Bill. And you still took me in when I needed help. You still sat with me all night because I couldn't be alone with my thoughts. You were grieving, Fleur said simply. Grief does not care about past hurt or who was unkind to who. It only cares about being witnessed, about not being alone in the dark. I understood that. I had my own grief. Who did you lose? Charlie asked gently. Fleur was quiet for a long moment. My cousin, Julian. He was fighting with the French resistance, trying to protect Muggle-borns who were fleeing to France. The Death Eaters caught him. They made an example. Her voice went flat, emotionless, in the way that meant the emotion was too large to contain. I could not go home for the funeral. It was too dangerous to travel. So I stayed here, in Britain, and I worked at Gringotts, and I pretended everything was fine when inside I was... She gestured helplessly. Shattered, Hermione supplied softly. You were shattered, like all of us. Yes, Fleur agreed. Shattered. But the pieces, they had to keep moving, keep working, keep pretending to be whole. Because if I stopped, if I let myself break completely, I did not think I would be able to put myself back together again. The table had gone silent, but it was a different silence than earlier, not uncomfortable or tense, but heavy with shared understanding. Everyone sitting there had lost someone. Everyone had been shattered and forced to keep moving anyway. It was the common language of survivors, the thread that connected them all. After the war, Fleur continued quietly, when it was finally over, I went home to France for a week, to see my family, to visit Julian's grave, to remember what it felt like to be in a place where I belonged without question. And my mother, she asked if I wanted to stay. She said I could come home, that I'd done enough, that I did not have to keep living in a country that had taken so much from me. What did you say? Ginny asked. Fleur looked at Bill, and her expression was soft, open in a way she rarely allowed herself to be. I said that Britain is home now, that Bill is home, that I'd found something here worth staying for, even with all the pain, even with all the loss. I chose to stay. I chose this. And I've been making you regret that choice, Molly said, and there was real anguish in her voice now. Making you feel unwelcome in the home you chose, making you question whether you belonged. Oh, Fleur, I'm so sorry. I've been so caught up in my own fear of losing Bill, my own grief for Fred. Her voice broke on her son's name, the son who'd survived the war but whose twin hadn't, whose laugh was now singular rather than doubled. I've been so caught up in holding tight to what I have left that I couldn't see I was pushing away someone who should be part of that, someone who already is part of that. We're all figuring it out, Arthur said gently, reaching across the table to take Molly's hand. How to live in a world after war, how to hold grief and joy at the same time, how to let new people in when we're terrified of losing anyone else. It's not easy. We're all going to make mistakes. But we can do better, Molly said, looking directly at Fleur. I can do better. I want to do better. If you'll give me the chance. Fleur's smile was tremulous, but genuine. I would like that very much, Molly. The use of the first name returned freely, felt like a seal on something, a promise, maybe, or a beginning. Right then, Fred said, breaking the emotional moment with characteristic timing. Now that we've all cried into our dessert and shared our trauma, can we talk about something less depressing, like Charlie's love life, or lack thereof? Oi, Charlie protested. My love life is fine. Thank you very much. You haven't dated anyone since that girl in Romania who turned out to be a Vila, George pointed out. She wasn't a Vila. She was just... Inhumanly beautiful and capable of literally enchanting you, Ginny supplied. Yeah, definitely not a Veela. I hate all of you, Charlie said, but he was grinning. The conversation devolved into good-natured teasing, flowing from Charlie's romantic misadventures to Ron's absolute disaster of a first date with Hermione. We didn't speak for 3 days after, because you were an insensitive prat. I was 14. To George's current attempt to woo a witch who worked at Flourish and Blots and seemed entirely immune to his charm. Through it all, Bill watched Fleur gradually relax, watched her join the conversation more naturally, watched her laugh at Fred's terrible jokes and offer her own gentle teasing. She was still nervous. He could see it in the way she sometimes hesitated before speaking, in the careful way she chose her words. But the desperate, anxious tension had eased. Molly, for her part, seemed determined to make up for earlier slights through sheer force of maternal attention. She insisted on cutting Fleur another slice of both desserts. You barely ate any. Asked questions about French magical traditions with genuine curiosity, and shared stories about her own difficult first years as a young wife trying to impress Arthur's family. His mother once served me soup that was clearly intended to test my fortitude, Molly said, shaking her head at the memory. It was purple, and it bubbled. When I asked what was in it, she just smiled mysteriously and said, family recipe. I was convinced she was trying to poison me. What was actually in it? Hermione asked, fascinated. To this day, I have no idea, but I ate every drop because I was not going to let her see me falter. I was sick for 2 days afterward. That is terrible, Fleur exclaimed. Why would she do that? Testing me, I think. Seeing if I was tough enough to be a Weasley. Or maybe she was just a bit mad. Both can be true. Molly smiled at the memory, though there was still a hint of old irritation there. The point is, families are complicated. In-laws are complicated. We all come at it with our own fears and expectations and ways of protecting what we love. But if we're lucky, if we try hard enough, we find our way through to something better. Like tonight, Arthur said softly. Yes, Molly agreed, looking around the table at her assembled family, blood and chosen both. Like tonight. Outside, darkness had fully settled, and through the kitchen windows, Bill could see stars beginning to appear in the clear summer sky. The garden gnomes had presumably gone to sleep. The chickens in their coop were silent. The whole world seemed to have gone quiet, leaving just this warm, bright kitchen full of people learning how to be family together. It wasn't perfect. It would never be perfect. There would be more awkward dinners, more misunderstandings, more moments when old fears and new uncertainties clashed. But looking at Fleur sitting beside his mother, both of them laughing at one of George's outrageous stories, Bill thought they'd turned an important corner. Sometimes, he reflected, the best things required breaking first, required shattering into pieces so they could be reassembled into something stronger, something that bore the marks of its repair but was more beautiful for them. Like a plate mended with magic, the cracks visible but healed. Like a family learning to expand, to include, to love beyond the boundaries of what they'd known before. Like home. The plates had been cleared, this time without incident, and the family had migrated from the cramped formality of the dining table to the more comfortable chaos of the sitting room. It was a gradual movement, the kind that happened naturally in the Weasley household. Arthur drifting toward his favorite armchair with a cup of tea, Fred and George sprawling on the floor near the fireplace to demonstrate their latest product idea, Ron and Hermione claiming the ancient sofa that sagged in the middle and forced its occupants to sit closer than they might have planned. Bill watched Fleur hesitate in the doorway, clearly uncertain where she fit in this new geography. The sitting room was smaller than the kitchen, more intimate, with mismatched furniture that had been accumulated over decades and walls covered in family photographs that moved and waved and occasionally shouted greetings. It was the heart of the house in a different way, less about function and more about simply being together. "Here," Ginny said, patting the space beside her on the window seat. "Best spot in the house. You can see the garden, and you're far enough from Fred and George that you won't get caught in the blast radius when their demonstration inevitably goes wrong." "It's not going to go wrong," George protested. "It always goes wrong," Ginny said. "That's half the point." Fleur moved to the window seat with visible relief, settling into the cushions that someone, probably Molly, had charmed to be perpetually comfortable regardless of how long you sat on them. Through the window, the garden was a patchwork of shadows and moonlight, peaceful in a way that made the war seem very far away. Bill took up a position leaning against the wall nearby, close enough to offer silent support, but trying not to hover. Fleur caught his eye and gave him a small smile, tired but genuine, the kind that said, "I'm all right. I can do this." Molly was the last to enter, carrying a tray laden with more tea, some biscuits that had appeared from somewhere, and what looked suspiciously like the last of the evening's treacle tart. She'd changed her apron for a cardigan, soft blue wool that Arthur had given her for Christmas years ago, and her hair, which had been pinned up severely during dinner, had been let down slightly, softening her appearance. She paused when she saw Fleur on the window seat, and something crossed her face. Calculation, perhaps, or decision. Then she moved deliberately across the room and settled into the armchair closest to the window, the one that had always been hers, the one that gave her a view of everyone and everything. Close enough to talk, close enough to try. "More tea?" Molly offered, already pouring without waiting for an answer in the way of mothers everywhere who believed most problems could be improved with a hot beverage and something sweet. "Thank you," Fleur said, accepting the cup with careful hands. "You are very kind." "It's just tea," Molly said, but her voice was softer than it had been earlier, less defensive. "Nothing special. Sometimes the simple things are the most special," Fleur replied, wrapping her hands around the cup as though drawing warmth from it. "My grandmère used to say that the everyday magics, tea, conversation, sitting together, these are what make a life worth living. Not the big moments, but the small ones, repeated over and over until they become a pattern, a habit, a home." Molly was quiet for a moment, studying Fleur with new attention. "Your grandmother sounds like she was very wise. You've mentioned her several times tonight. You must miss her terribly." "Every day," Fleur admitted, "especially now when I'm trying to navigate something new and difficult. She would have known what to do, what to say. She always did." "What do you think she would say about tonight?" Ginny asked, drawing her knees up to her chest and regarding Fleur with curiosity. "About the disasters and the crying and the plate shattering." Fleur considered this seriously. She would say that the first dinner with new family is supposed to be a disaster. That if it goes too smoothly, it means no one is trying hard enough. No one is being brave enough to be real. The disasters, she would say, are where the truth lives, where people show who they really are when the perfect masks slip. I like that philosophy, Arthur said from his chair, his eyes twinkling over the rim of his teacup. Very practical, very honest. She was both of those things, Fleur said. Practical and honest. Sometimes brutally honest. She once told my sister that her boyfriend was, how do you say, a pompous ass. That's exactly how you say it, Ron confirmed, grinning. She was right, of course. Gabrielle married someone else, someone much better. Grandmère said she could always see through the pretty words to what was underneath. She could see what mattered. Molly shifted in her chair, and Bill recognized the particular quality of her silence, the kind that meant she was thinking hard about something, working through emotions and realizations that didn't come easily. His mother had never been particularly good at admitting when she was wrong, had never found it easy to change her mind once it was made up. But she was trying now. Bill could see it, trying to look past her own assumptions and fears to see what was actually in front of her. What do you think she would have seen in me? Molly asked suddenly, and the question was vulnerable in a way his mother rarely allowed herself to be. Your grandmother. What would she have seen underneath? Fleur tilted her head, considering Molly with the same serious attention she'd given the question about her grandmother's advice. I think she would have seen a mother who loves fiercely and fears just as fiercely, who has lost so much that the idea of losing more is unbearable, who protects what is hers with everything she has, even when the protection becomes a cage. She paused. I think she would have understood that. She lost her husband in the First War with Grindelwald. She knew about fear disguised as anger, about love that hurts because it is too big to fit inside just one person. Molly's eyes were bright with unshed tears. She sounds extraordinary. She was, Fleur said simply. Like you. The comparison seemed to startle Molly. I'm not. You are, Fleur interrupted gently. You held your family together through 2 wars. You fed the Order, sheltered the fighters, kept the Ohm fires burning when everything else was darkness. You lost a son, and still you found the strength to keep loving the rest, to keep feeding them and fussing over them and making sure they knew they were safe, they were loved, they were Ohm. That is extraordinary. That is magic more powerful than anything they teach at Hogwarts. Molly made a sound that might have been a laugh or might have been a sob. I didn't feel extraordinary. I felt terrified. Every time one of them left for a mission, every time I didn't hear from them for days, I was convinced that would be it. That would be the time they didn't come back. And Fred, her voice cracked. Fred didn't come back, not whole. Part of George died with him. Part of all of us died with him. The room had gone very quiet. Even Fred and George, who had been whispering about enchanted fireworks, had fallen silent. This was still too raw, too close. The war had ended only months ago, and the losses were still fresh, still bleeding. I know, Fleur said softly. I did not know Fred well. I wish I'd known him better, known both of them better. But I saw what his loss did to all of you, the hole that it left, and I think... She paused, choosing her words with care. I think Maybe that is part of why you are angry with me, no? Because I came into the family after, when the spaces were already empty, when the losses were already counted. I was something new when everything new felt like a betrayal of what was lost. Molly stared at her, and Bill could see his mother really seeing Fleur for perhaps the first time, not as a threat or an interloper or a too beautiful girl who'd stolen her son, but as a person who understood loss, who'd survived her own war, who was trying to navigate grief and family and belonging with the same desperate uncertainty Molly herself felt. "Yes," Molly whispered. "Yes, I think you're right. I've been so angry at the war for taking Fred, angry at the world for continuing when he couldn't, angry at myself for not being able to protect him, and angry at you." She stopped, swallowed hard. "Angry at you for being alive when he's not, for being new and happy and in love when we're all still so broken. And that's not fair. It's not fair, and it's not kind, and I'm ashamed of it. But it's true. Grief is not fair," Fleur said, and her voice carried the weight of experience. "Grief does not care about what is fair or kind or rational. It just is. Like the tide, like the seasons. It comes and goes, and we cannot control it, only survive it." "How do you survive it?" Ginny asked, and her voice was small in a way Bill hadn't heard since she was a child. "How do you keep going when the person you lost was half of who you were?" She was asking about Fred and George, Bill realized, about the twin bond that had defined them both, about George trying to exist as a singular entity when he'd never been meant to be alone. Fleur looked at George, who had gone very still, his expression carefully blank in the way that meant he was holding back everything he felt. "You survive by remembering that he would not want you to stop living. You survive by carrying him with you, in the stories you tell, in the jokes you still make, in the way you love the people he loved. You survive by letting the grief be part of you without letting it be all of you." "Easier said than done," George muttered. "Yes," Fleur agreed, "much easier. I will not pretend it is simple, or that some days will not feel impossible. But you have something important, I think. You have each other." She gestured around the room, encompassing all of them. "You have this family, these people who knew him and loved him and will never let him be forgotten. That is not nothing. That is everything." Arthur cleared his throat roughly, his own eyes damp. "She's right, you know. We have each other. That's what Fred would want, for us to stick together, to keep loving each other, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. And to keep laughing," Fred added, his voice rough but determined. "Can't forget the laughing. George and I, Fred and I, we always said that if you can't laugh at the darkness, it wins. So we laugh, even when it feels wrong, especially when it feels wrong." "He'd approve of tonight, I think," Charlie said thoughtfully. The gravy on the ceiling, the shattered plate, the crying into dessert. Very Weasley, very chaotic, very us. "He would have made it worse on purpose," Fleur said, and there was a hint of amusement in her voice. "Made the gravy explode bigger, charmed the plate to shatter into the shape of something rude, something to make everyone laugh even while they were upset." "See, she gets it," George said, pointing at Fleur with something like approval. "She understands the Fred philosophy, chaos in service of joy." Molly laughed wetly, wiping at her eyes with the sleeve of her cardigan. "He would have loved that." making tonight even more disastrous than it already was. Probably would have enchanted the tarte tatin to sing French opera or something equally ridiculous. And we would have let him, Fleur said, because that is what family does. They let you be ridiculous, and they love you anyway. Something in Molly's expression shifted then, the last of her resistance crumbling away like sand. She set down her teacup with a decisive click, then stood and crossed the small distance to the window seat. Fleur looked up at her with uncertain hope, and for a moment, neither of them moved. Then Molly reached out and took Fleur's hand in both of hers, holding it gently, carefully, as though it was something precious and fragile. "I've been awful to you," Molly said, and her voice was thick with tears and regret, and the kind of honesty that only came after walls had been torn down. "I've been cold and unwelcoming and critical, and I've made you feel like you don't belong here. But you do belong. You're Bill's wife, your family, and more than that, you're kind and brave, and you understand things that I've been too angry to see. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for making this harder than it needed to be." Fleur's own tears spilled over, tracking down her cheeks in silver trails. "You were protecting what you love. I understand that. If I had children, when I have children, I would do the same. I would be fierce and frightening and probably unfair, because that is what love does. It makes us fierce." "Will you forgive me?" Molly asked. "Will you give me a chance to do better, to be better?" "Only if you will forgive me," Fleur replied, "for being clumsy, for breaking the eggs, for not knowing how to fit into a family that has its own rhythms and traditions that I am still learning." "There's nothing to forgive," Molly said firmly. "You didn't break anything that matters. You just rearranged some things, made space for yourself. That's what you're supposed to do." They sat like that for a long moment, hands clasped, tears falling, while the rest of the family watched with varying degrees of emotional investment. Bill felt his own throat tighten, felt Charlie's hand land on his shoulder in silent solidarity. Then Fleur did something that Bill hadn't expected. She stood, still holding Molly's hand, and pulled his mother into an embrace. It was careful at first, tentative, as though she expected rejection. But Molly's arms came up immediately, wrapping around Fleur and holding her tight in that particular way mothers had. That bone-crushing hug that said, "You're mine now. I'm keeping you. Nothing will harm you while I'm here." "Welcome to the family," Molly whispered against Fleur's hair. "Properly, this time. Welcome home." Fleur made a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "Thank you. Thank you for giving me a chance. Thank you for being patient with a stubborn old woman who didn't know what was good for her. You are not old. I'm old enough to know better than I've been acting." Molly pulled back slightly, keeping her hands on Fleur's shoulders, looking at her seriously. "I want to know you properly, not the version I invented in my head, the one I was afraid of, but the real you. I want to know about your family, your traditions, what you miss about France, what you love about Britain. I want to teach you the Weasley family recipes, the real ones, with all the shortcuts and the bits where things usually go wrong. I want to hear stories about Bill that he's too modest to tell himself. I want—" She stopped, collecting herself. "I want to be your mother too, if you'll let me. Not to replace your own mother, but in addition to. Is that all right?" Fleur nodded, unable to speak, and Molly pulled her close again. Bill felt something tight and anxious in his chest finally release, felt the breath he'd been holding since they'd arrived finally exhale. This moment right here was what he'd been hoping for without quite letting himself believe it could happen. His mother and his wife finding their way to each other through the mess and the tears and the honest vulnerability that was harder than any magic. "Right," Ron said loudly, clearly uncomfortable with the emotional intensity and desperate to lighten the mood. "Now that we've all had a good cry and hugged it out, can we please do something less emotionally devastating, like play Exploding Snap, or discuss Quidditch, or literally anything else?" "You're just afraid you're going to start crying," Hermione accused. "I'm not going to. My eyes are just watering. It's dusty in here." "It's not dusty. It's very dusty. Terrible housekeeping, really. Mum should be ashamed." Molly laughed, still holding Fleur, and the sound was lighter than Bill had heard it in months. "My housekeeping is fine, Ronald Weasley. You're just emotionally constipated." "I'm not emotionally anything." "You cried during a Celestina Warbeck song last week," Ginny pointed out. "I saw you." She has a very moving voice. The room dissolved into laughter and good-natured arguing, the tension finally completely broken. Molly released Fleur, but kept hold of her hand, drawing her back to the seating area, this time claiming space on the sofa and pulling Fleur down beside her. They sat close, shoulders touching, like old friends or family who'd known each other for years rather than a mother-in-law and daughter-in-law navigating their first real conversation. "Tell me about your mother," Molly said, settling in with the expression of someone prepared to listen for as long as necessary. "About your family. I want to know where you come from, who shaped you into the woman my son fell in love with." And Fleur, still tearful but glowing with something like happiness, began to talk about her mother Apolline, who'd been a professional wand-maker before retiring to raise her daughters, about her father Jean-Luc, who worked in magical creature relations and had an unfortunate tendency to bring his work home, literally, resulting in a house that occasionally had a demi-guise in the pantry or a mooncalf in the garden. About Gabrielle, her younger sister, who was finishing her final year at Beauxbatons and who desperately wanted to visit Britain to see where Fleur had built her new life. "She should come," Molly said immediately. "Bring her for dinner. Bring your whole family if they'll come. I want to meet them properly. I want to—" She paused, then said firmly, "I want to do this right. All of it. You're part of our family now, which means your family is part of our family, and families should know each other." "That would be wonderful," Fleur said, her smile brilliant and genuine. "They would love that. My mother especially. She worries about me, being so far from home. It would make her feel better to see where I am, to know the people I am with." "Then we'll make it happen," Arthur said, already looking pleased at the prospect of meeting more people, learning more about French magical culture, probably asking hundreds of questions about wand-making and French ministry operations and whatever else caught his endless curiosity. "A proper family dinner. We'll do it properly this time. No disasters." "Where's the fun in that?" George asked. "Disasters are tradition." "Controlled disasters," Arthur amended. "Intentional disasters, not accidental plate shattering." "The best disasters are always accidental," Fred argued. "That's what makes them disasters." As the family devolved into a spirited debate about the nature of disasters and whether they could truly be controlled. Bill caught Fleur's eye across the room. She was smiling, really smiling, the kind that reached her eyes and transformed her face from beautiful to radiant. She looked happy. She looked, Bill thought, like she'd finally stopped holding her breath, finally allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she belonged here after all. He smiled back, and in that moment, the chaotic, crowded sitting room of the Burrow felt exactly right, felt like home in the truest sense. Not perfect, not calm, not easy, but full of love and laughter and people who were learning how to be family together, one disaster at a time. Outside, the moon rose higher over the garden, painting everything in silver. The gnomes resumed their cabbage campaign. A gentle breeze carried the scent of roses and earth and magic through the open windows. And inside, the Weasley family, expanded now by one fierce, brave, complicated French witch, settled in for the evening, passing biscuits and tea and stories and the kind of warmth that couldn't be created with magic, only with time and effort and the willingness to keep trying, even when it was hard. Especially when it was hard. The evening had settled into something comfortable, the kind of easy warmth that came after emotional storms had passed, and everyone could finally breathe without wondering when the next disaster would strike. The fire in the hearth had been coaxed into cheerful life. George's doing, with a spell that made the flames dance in colors that shifted from orange to blue to green and back again. It was mesmerizing and slightly hypnotic, and Bill suspected it was intentional, a way to give everyone something to look at that wasn't each other's tear-stained faces. Fleur had relaxed in a way Bill hadn't seen all evening, her posture no longer rigid with anxiety, her hands no longer twisting in her lap. She sat beside Molly on the sofa, their shoulders touching in casual intimacy, and they were deep in conversation about something that involved a lot of hand gestures and occasional laughter. Bill couldn't hear all of it from his position by the window, but he caught fragments, something about the proper way to preserve herbs, the difference between French and British magical gardening techniques, whether lavender was better fresh or dried for calming drafts. It was domestic, ordinary, exactly what he'd hoped for when Molly had first issued the dinner invitation. "You can stop hovering now," Charlie said quietly, appearing at Bill's elbow with 2 glasses of fire whiskey. "She's fine, more than fine. Mum's already planning their next cooking session together. Something about teaching Fleur the secret to Yorkshire pudding in exchange for learning proper French bread making." Bill accepted the glass gratefully, taking a sip of the smooth, smoky liquid. "I wasn't hovering." "You were absolutely hovering. You've been watching them like a nervous crup, watching its owner near a cliff edge." Charlie grinned. "It's endearing, actually. Never thought I'd see you this gone over someone." "I'm not—" Bill stopped, recognizing the futility of denial. "All right, fine. I'm gone. Completely. She could probably ask me to wrestle a dragon right now, and I'd do it. Please don't give her ideas. We have enough problems without adding dragon wrestling to the family activities list." Charlie leaned against the window frame, his own gaze drifting to where Fleur and Molly sat. "She's good for you, you know. Fleur, I wasn't sure at first. None of us were, if we're honest. But seeing you together, seeing how she handled tonight, she's tougher than she looks. Tougher than anyone gives her credit for," Bill agreed. "People see the Vila heritage, the appearance, and they stop looking. They don't see the steel underneath, the stubbornness, The absolute refusal to give up even when everything's going wrong. Sounds familiar, Charlie said dryly. Pretty sure that's the Weasley family motto. Stubborn gits who refuse to know when they're beaten. Better than the pre-wet motto. Hold my beer and watch this. Charlie snorted into his fire whiskey. That explains so much about Mum. Across the room, Ron had managed to locate a deck of exploding snap cards and was attempting to convince Hermione that playing would be relaxing and fun rather than a recipe for singed eyebrows and property damage. Hermione looked skeptical, but was allowing herself to be persuaded, probably because she was still riding the high of successfully navigating an emotionally complex family dinner without any major interpersonal incidents. Fred and George had abandoned their firework demonstration in favor of what appeared to be an intense discussion about shop inventory and whether they should expand into the international market. Bill caught phrases like French wizards love a good prank and imagine the profit margins, and suspected Fleur would be receiving some very pointed questions about French import regulations before the night was over. Arthur had pulled out a battered notebook and was sketching something that looked suspiciously like a diagram of a Muggle electrical circuit, occasionally asking Hermione questions about the function of these resistor things and whether Muggles had figured out how to make electricity sentient yet. It was chaos, but the good kind. The kind that meant family. Ginny had claimed the armchair Molly had vacated, curled up with her feet tucked beneath her, and was watching the room with the quiet observation that had become characteristic of her since the war. She'd always been sharp, his younger sister, but the war had honed that sharpness into something more dangerous, more knowing. She saw things others missed, understood the currents beneath the surface. She caught Bill's eye and raised her own glass. She'd somehow acquired cider from somewhere, in a silent salute. "You did good," the gesture said. "She did good. We're good." Bill raised his fire whiskey in return, feeling some of the tension he'd been carrying for weeks finally ease. It hadn't been perfect tonight. It had been messy and painful, and at times excruciating. But they'd gotten through it, and on the other side was something that felt like the beginning of real acceptance, real family. "Bill, darling," Molly called from the sofa. "Come here a moment. Fleur is telling me about the protection charms at Shell Cottage, and I want to know if you've considered layering them with the old pre-wet family wards. They're tricky to implement, but nearly unbreakable once properly established." Bill crossed to the sofa, settling on the armrest beside Fleur. She leaned into him automatically, a gesture so natural it made his heart do something complicated in his chest. He pressed a kiss to the top of her head, catching the scent of her shampoo, something French and floral that he'd never be able to identify, but would always associate with home. "The pre-wet wards are blood-based though, aren't they?" Bill said, thinking through the complexities. "They require family connections to anchor properly." "Which you have now," Molly said. And there was something significant in the way she said it, the way she looked at Fleur. "Fleur is family, blood of my blood through marriage, which makes her blood tied to the pre-wet line through me. The wards would recognize her, protect her." Fleur looked startled, then touched. "I did not know that was how it worked. The blood magic, I mean. I thought it was only, how do you say, direct descendants. Marriage creates blood ties in magical lore, Hermione piped up from where she was shuffling exploding snap cards with exaggerated care. It's one of the few areas where magical theory actually acknowledges chosen family as equivalent to biological family. The wards don't distinguish between children born to you and children married into the family. It's all the same magical signature once the marriage bond is recognized. Which is why, Molly continued, her voice gentle but firm, I want to teach you the pre-wet wards. They're passed down mother to daughter in my family, or in this case, mother to daughter-in-law. They should be yours, to protect your home, your family, your... She paused meaningfully. Your future children, when they come. Bill felt Fleur go very still beside him, felt the way her breath caught. They talked about children in the quiet hours at Shell Cottage, in the abstract way of people who were still processing a war and couldn't quite imagine bringing new life into a world that had so recently been drenched in death. But it was something they both wanted, eventually, when the time was right, when the world felt safe enough. You would teach me? Fleur asked, her voice small. The pre-wet wards? But they are family magic, precious magic. Are you certain? I'm certain, Molly said, and she reached out to take Fleur's hand again. That gesture that had become their new language, reaching, connecting, choosing each other. Your family, Fleur, which means what's ours is yours. The magic, the traditions, the ridiculous stories, and the terrible recipes, and the wards that have protected Weasleys and Prewets for generations. All of it. You don't have to earn it. You already belong to it, and it belongs to you. Fleur's eyes were bright with tears again. Happy ones this time, Bill noted with relief. Thank you, she whispered. That means more than I can say. More than I can... She switched to French, the words tumbling out too fast for Bill to catch all of them. But he heard famille and honneur and gratitude, heard the emotion that couldn't be contained in English alone. Molly, who didn't speak French, seemed to understand anyway in the way that mothers did. She pulled Fleur into another embrace, this one less fraught than the earlier ones, more comfortable. The embrace of family who knew they'd have thousands more chances to hug, to talk, to be together. Right then, Arthur said, standing and stretching. I think this calls for a toast, an official one, not the silly ones the boys made earlier. Oi, Fred protested. Our toasts were excellent. Your toasts were half-assed and mostly about gravy, Ginny said. Gravy is important. Arthur ignored them with the practice of someone who'd been ignoring those particular twins for decades. He raised his glass. When had everyone acquired glasses? Bill wondered. Had they always had them? Had Molly been quietly distributing drinks while he wasn't paying attention, and waited for the room to settle into attentive quiet? To Fleur, Arthur said, his voice warm and sincere, in the way that made it clear why he'd been such an effective order member despite his mild-mannered appearance. Who has shown more courage tonight than in any battle? Who broke our plates and shattered our assumptions and made us all see that family isn't about perfection. It's about showing up, being honest, and trying again, even when it's hard. Welcome to the family, my dear, properly and officially. We're very glad you're here. To Fleur, the room chorused, glasses raised, and Bill saw his wife's face transform with joy and relief, and that particular kind of happiness that came from finally being seen and accepted for exactly who you were. They drank, and then George was insisting that Fleur, needed to make a toast in return, and Fleur was protesting that her English wasn't good enough for formal toasts, and everyone was shouting that she should do it in French and they'd figure it out from context. And somehow they ended up with Fleur standing in the middle of the sitting room, glass raised, attempting to express gratitude in 2 languages at once, while everyone listened with rapt attention. "To family," Fleur said finally, settling on English with only the lightest accent coloring the words. "The one we are born to, and the one we choose, the one that breaks our hearts and mends them again, the one that lets us be ridiculous and loves us anyway. Thank you for choosing me. Thank you for letting me choose you. I will," her voice cracked, "I will try very hard to be worthy of this." "You already are," Molly said firmly. "You don't have to try to be worthy. You just have to be yourself. That's more than enough." They drank again, and this time when the glasses were lowered, something fundamental had shifted in the room's atmosphere. The last traces of tension, the last whispers of doubt and anxiety had finally dissipated. What remained was warmth and acceptance, and the particular kind of love that families built over time, layer by layer, moment by moment. "Now," Molly said, all business again, "let's talk about Sunday lunch. Fleur, what do you like to eat? What can't you stand?" Bill has always been impossible about mushrooms, refuses to eat them no matter how I prepare them, so I need to know your preferences so I can plan accordingly. "I eat everything," Fleur assured her. "Truly. Well, except I do not like, how you say, blood pudding. It is too much." "Blood pudding is disgusting," Ginny agreed. "I'm with you on that one." "It's not disgusting," Ron protested. "It's traditional." "It's traditionally disgusting," Hermione said. "Just because something is traditional doesn't mean it's good." The argument about blood pudding escalated with impressive speed, encompassing everything from its nutritional value to its appearance to whether the name alone was enough to disqualify it from consideration as legitimate food. Bill let the familiar chaos wash over him, content to sit beside Fleur while his family argued about breakfast meats with the same intensity other families might reserve for political debates or Quidditch rivalries. Fleur leaned into him, her head resting on his shoulder, and he felt her relax completely for the first time all evening. "We survived," she murmured. "You survived," Bill corrected. "You were amazing. I'm so proud of you. I cried 3 times and broke a plate. You were vulnerable and honest and brave enough to keep trying even when everything went wrong. That's not nothing. That's everything." Fleur tilted her head up to look at him, and her smile was soft and private, just for him. "I love you." "I love you too," Bill said, kissing her softly, not caring that his entire family was watching, and that Fred was making gagging noises, and George was narrating their kiss like a Quidditch match commentary. When they pulled apart, Molly was watching them with an expression that was equal parts amused and tender. "You'll stay tonight," she said, and it wasn't quite a question. "Both of you. It's late, and I won't have you apparating when you're both exhausted. Besides, I want to make you breakfast, a proper Weasley breakfast. I'll show you how to make the eggs the way Arthur likes them, all fluffy and—" "Mum," Bill interrupted gently. "We don't want to impose—" "You're not imposing," Molly said firmly. "You're family, and family stays. Bill, your room is exactly as you left it, though I suppose you'll want to share with Fleur now." She paused, looking momentarily flustered by the implications of her married son, sharing a bedroom with his wife under her roof. "Well, you're adults. You're married. There are clean sheets and extra pillows. I'll make sure you have everything you need." "Thank you, Molly," Fleur said, and the name came more easily now, less fraught with anxiety. "That is very kind. We would love to stay." "It's settled then." Molly stood, brushing off her skirt with the air of someone who'd made a decision and considered the matter closed. "I'll go make up the bed properly. Bill, show Fleur where everything is. Towels are in the bathroom cupboard, though mind the bottom shelf. It's got a boggart in it I haven't gotten around to dealing with. Charlie, help your father with those diagrams before he accidentally invents something that violates the International Statute of Secrecy. Fred, George, whatever you're whispering about, the answer is no." "We weren't going to," Fred started. "The answer is still no," Molly said, already heading for the stairs. Bill stood, offering his hand to Fleur, who took it and allowed herself to be pulled to her feet. They said their good nights to the family, Hermione hugging Fleur with surprising fierceness, Ron giving an awkward thumbs up, Ginny offering a genuine smile, Arthur kissing Fleur's cheek in the continental style she'd taught him, Charlie clapping Bill on the shoulder, Fred and George presenting Fleur with a small box of what they claimed were family-approved defense products for dealing with difficult goblins, and made their way toward the stairs. "Your family is wonderful," Fleur said quietly as they climbed. "Exhausting, but wonderful." "They're a lot," Bill agreed, "but they're ours now, both of ours." His old room was at the top of the house, tucked under the eaves in a space that had once felt enormous when he was a child, but now seemed cozy and intimate. The ceiling sloped at odd angles, forcing anyone over 6 feet tall to duck in certain spots. The walls were still covered in faded posters of his favorite Quidditch teams, maps of Egypt where he'd marked curse-breaking sites, photographs of Hogwarts friends who'd scattered to various parts of the world. His old trunk sat at the foot of the bed, and his Gryffindor scarf hung from a hook by the door, right where he'd left it years ago. It was a time capsule, this room, a preserved moment of who he'd been before the world got complicated, before wars and scars and choosing to build a life with someone. Fleur moved through the space slowly, examining everything with interest. The posters, the photographs, the collection of interesting stones he'd gathered from various curse-breaking sites and never quite managed to throw away. She picked up a small pyramid-shaped rock from his desk, turning it over in her hands. "Egypt?" she asked. "Giza. Found it in a tomb I was clearing. Not magical, just pretty. I liked the way it caught the light." Fleur set it down carefully, then turned to face him, and her expression was soft and happy, and tinged with the exhaustion of a long, emotionally demanding evening. "Take me to bed, Bill Weasley. I'm tired of being brave for one night." "You can stop being brave now," Bill promised, crossing to her and pulling her close. "You're safe here. You're home." "Yes," Fleur agreed, her arms wrapping around his waist, her head fitting perfectly under his chin. "I think I am." Outside, the moon continued its arc across the sky. The garden gnomes settled into their various sleeping spots, under the shed, in the roses, one particularly bold one in the chicken coop. The burrow creaked and settled around them, the old house breathing like a living thing, content to have all its people gathered under one crooked roof. And in a room at the top of the house, Bill Weasley held his wife and thought about how strange and wonderful it was that the hardest evenings could transform into the best ones if everyone was brave enough to keep trying. If everyone was brave enough to reach out, take a hand, and choose each other again and again, even when it was hard, especially when it was hard. Tomorrow, there would be breakfast and probably more chaos. There would be the beginning of Sunday lunches and cooking lessons, and the slow, patient work of building real relationships rather than polite ones. But tonight, they could rest. Tonight, they were home. Morning came to the burrow the way it always did, gradually, noisily, and with the distinct impression that the house itself was waking up along with its inhabitants. Bill surfaced from sleep to the sound of roosters crowing in aggressive competition, the distant clatter of pots and pans from the kitchen, and Arthur's voice drifting up through the floorboards, asking someone, probably Molly, whether she'd seen his good wand, the one he used for delicate Muggle artifact repair work, because the other one had a tendency to make things spark unexpectedly. Beside him, Fleur was still asleep, her silvery hair spread across the pillow like moonlight made tangible. Her face in sleep was softer than in waking, younger somehow, without the careful composure she maintained during the day. Bill watched her for a moment, allowing himself the simple pleasure of observing his wife without agenda or audience. Just the quiet intimacy of shared space and steady breathing. The room was bright with early summer sun filtering through curtains that had been faded by years of exactly this light. Dust motes danced in the beams, and somewhere outside, a garden gnome was having a very loud argument with what sounded like a chicken. Bill suspected the chicken was winning. Last night felt both immediate and distant. The anxiety, the disasters, the tears, and the ultimate resolution. He could still see Fleur's stricken face when the plate had shattered, still hear his mother's careful apology, still feel the moment when everything had finally, blessedly shifted from tense to warm. It had been exhausting and transformative, and now, in the gentle morning light, it felt like something they'd survived together, made stronger by the breaking and mending. Fleur's eyes opened slowly, the blue of them catching the sunlight and transforming into something luminous. She blinked at him, momentarily disoriented, then smiled as memory and recognition settled in. "Bonjour," she murmured, her voice rough with sleep. "Good morning," Bill replied, leaning in to kiss her forehead. "Sleep well?" "Like the dead. Your bed, it is not very big, but it is comfortable, and you are warm." She stretched languidly, cat-like, then paused as a particularly loud crash echoed from downstairs, followed by Ron's voice shouting something that sounded like, "I didn't mean to," and Ginny's laugh. "What is happening down there?" Fleur asked. "Weasley morning," Bill said. "It's a bit like Weasley evening, but with breakfast foods and less emotional processing. Probably. Actually, scratch that. There's always emotional processing. Just with eggs this time." Fleur laughed softly, the sound doing pleasant things to Bill's equilibrium. "I should get up. I should help your mother with breakfast. She said she would teach me the eggs, the fluffy ones." "She won't mind if you sleep in," Bill assured her, though he was already sitting up, already reaching for his wand to perform the basic grooming charms that would make him presentable for family breakfast. "You're a guest." "I am family," Fleur corrected, and there was satisfaction in her voice, a quiet joy at being able to claim that identity. Family helps. Family does not sleep late while others work. She was right, of course, and Bill could see how much it mattered to her. This opportunity to be useful, to contribute, to prove that last night's acceptance was real and lasting and not something that would evaporate in the harsh light of morning. They dressed quickly in the clothes Molly had thoughtfully placed outside their door sometime in the night. One of Bill's old Weasley sweaters for him, and for Fleur, something that looked suspiciously like it might have belonged to Ginny once upon a time, a soft green jumper and comfortable jeans. The gesture was small but significant, Molly providing clothes, including Fleur in the casual sharing of garments that characterized large families. "Ready?" Bill asked, offering his hand. Fleur took it, her grip firm and certain. "Ready." They descended the stairs together, navigating the irregular steps that had been built by someone with either a very poor understanding of standard construction or a very good understanding of how to make a house feel alive and slightly mischievous. The Burrow stairs were never quite the same twice. They shifted slightly, changed their creaking patterns, occasionally sprouted an extra step just to keep people on their toes. The kitchen was controlled chaos, which was to say it was a typical Weasley morning. Molly stood at the stove, directing operations with the efficiency of a battlefield general, her wand flicking between multiple pans while she simultaneously monitored the coffee percolator, the toast situation, and what appeared to be porridge that was stirring itself with a wooden spoon that kept trying to escape. Ron and Hermione sat at the table, both looking slightly rumpled and very much in love, in that new, slightly dazed way of people who were still marveling at the fact that their feelings were mutual. Ron was reading the Daily Prophet upside down, probably accidentally, while Hermione corrected him without looking up from her own section of the paper. Ginny was setting the table with wandwork, plates and cutlery floating through the air in neat formation, while she simultaneously argued with George about something related to Quidditch statistics and whether the Holyhead Harpies had any chance of winning the league this year. Arthur sat at the head of the table, his nose buried in a Muggle manual for something called a toaster, occasionally muttering things like "fascinating" and "but how does it know when the bread is done?" and "Molly, we need one of these." Charlie was absent, Bill noted, probably already out in the garden or checking on something animal-related. Charlie had never been much for sitting still at breakfast when there were creatures to tend. "Good morning," Molly called out, spotting them in the doorway, her face lit up with genuine warmth, the kind that couldn't be faked or forced. "Fleur, dear, you're up. I was just about to start the eggs. Perfect timing. Come here, I'll show you the trick. It's all in the wrist action with the whisk, and you have to add the cream at exactly the right temperature, or it goes flat." Fleur moved toward the stove without hesitation, and Bill felt a surge of pride watching her integrate herself into the morning routine. She tied back her hair with a ribbon she'd somehow produced from her pocket, rolled up her sleeves, and paid careful attention as Molly demonstrated the proper technique for what she called Weasley scrambled eggs, which apparently involved more whisking than any reasonable person would consider necessary. "See?" Molly was saying, her hands guiding Fleur's on the whisk. "You want to keep it moving constantly, very light, very quick, like you're trying to incorporate air, not just mix eggs. There, yes, exactly like that. You're a natural." "My grand-mère would say I am too heavy-handed with the whisk, Fleur admitted. She tried to teach me many times, but I always, how do you say, I always overdid it? Nonsense, Molly said firmly. You're doing beautifully. Grandmères can be overly critical sometimes. I know, mine was. Probably thought it was building character or some such. Really, it was just making me anxious about cooking for years. The easy admission, the casual sharing of her own insecurities, was another small bridge being built. Bill watched them work together. Two women who'd started as adversaries, finding common ground in whisked eggs and kitchen confidences. Bill, stop lurking and sit down, Ginny called. You're not needed for this operation. You'll just get in the way. I don't lurk, Bill protested, but he moved to the table and claimed a seat beside Ron, who glanced up from his upside-down paper and grinned. Morning. Sleep well in your childhood bed with your wife? That must have been weird. Ron, Hermione said warningly. What? I'm just saying, it's got to be strange, like worlds colliding, past and present, and… Do you want me to hex you before or after breakfast? Bill asked mildly. After, please. I'm starving. Fred emerged from the pantry carrying an armload of jams and preserves. Morning all. Fleur, I see Mum's already recruited you for kitchen duty. That's how it starts, you know. First the eggs, then the entire Sunday roast. Then before you know it, you are hosting Christmas dinner and wondering how your life got to this point. I would be happy to help with Christmas dinner, Fleur said, not looking up from her whisking. If Molly would like the help. I would love the help, Molly said immediately. We could do something traditional British and something traditional French. A fusion Christmas. That would be lovely. Mum's already planning Christmas, and it's only June, George observed, wandering in from the garden with dirt on his knees and what looked like a satisfied niffler clinging to his shoulder. That's either very organized or slightly concerning. It's never too early to plan Christmas, Molly said. And George Weasley. Get that creature out of my kitchen before it steals all the silverware. He's not going to steal. George stopped as the niffler immediately made a grab for a serving spoon. Okay, fine. He might steal the silverware. Come on, Nigel. Back to the shed with you. As George departed with the disappointed niffler, Charlie entered through the back door, his boots muddy and his expression content. Morning. Something died near the chicken coop. I've dealt with it. You're welcome. Also, I think the gnomes are planning something. They had a meeting under the shed. Very organized. Very suspicious. Gnomes are always planning something, Arthur said, finally looking up from his toaster manual. Usually it involves the cabbages. Sometimes it involves revenge against the chickens. Once it involved a complicated scheme to overthrow the garden shed as a power structure. I respect their ambition. You respect their what? Hermione asked, looking bemused. Their ambition. Small creatures, big dreams. Very Gryffindor of them, really. Breakfast came together with the organized chaos that characterized all Weasley meals. Plates filled with fluffy scrambled eggs. Fleur's technique pronounced excellent by everyone who tried them. Perfectly browned toast. Bacon that was crispy without being burnt. Grilled tomatoes, mushrooms, which Bill pushed to the side of his plate, and fresh fruit that Ginny had apparently retrieved from some hidden stash in the cold cellar. The table was crowded, elbows bumping, conversations overlapping. But there was a rightness to it that hadn't existed the night before. Fleur fit into the puzzle now. her presence no longer an awkward addition, but a natural extension of the family unit. She laughed at Fred's terrible jokes, engaged Hermione in a spirited discussion about the ethics of house elf employment, listened with genuine interest as Arthur explained the mystifying concept of pop-up toasters, and accepted seconds when Molly offered them without the hesitation that had characterized last night's dinner. Bill watched it all, his heart full of something that felt like contentment, mixed with relief, mixed with gratitude. This was what he'd wanted. Not perfection, not a fairy tale, but the messy, complicated, beautiful reality of two families becoming one. "So," Ron said, around a mouthful of eggs, "when are you two having kids?" The table went silent. "Ronald Weasley," Molly snapped, "that is not appropriate breakfast conversation." "What? I'm just asking. They're married. That's usually the next step, isn't it?" "The next step," Hermione said icily, "is you learning some basic social grace and not interrogating people about their reproductive plans over breakfast." "I wasn't interrogating. I was just—" Bill held up a hand, forestalling what was clearly about to become a lengthy argument. "It's fine. Ron, we'll have kids when we have kids. No timeline, no pressure. Right now, we're just enjoying being married and not actively fighting a war." "But eventually?" Molly asked, and there was hope in her voice, carefully restrained but present nonetheless. Fleur glanced at Bill, and in her eyes he saw the question. "Do you want to answer this? Do we answer this together?" He nodded slightly. "Together." "Eventually," Fleur said, addressing Molly directly, "we would like children. Several, I think. A house full of noise and chaos and love. But not yet. Not until we've had time to just be us, to build our life together without the war hanging over everything. We want to bring children into a world that feels safe, that feels like home. We want to be ready." "That's very sensible," Arthur said approvingly. "Take your time. Build your foundation. Children are wonderful, but they're also exhausting and expensive, and they'll break all your valuables and test every boundary you set. Best to be prepared." "Very encouraging, Dad," Ginny said dryly. "Really selling the whole parenting experience there." "I'm being realistic. I love all of you, but you are collectively responsible for more property damage than any other family in Ottery St. Catchpole. The local authorities had a file on us. An actual file." "We were creative," Fred defended. "You were disasters," Molly corrected, but she was smiling. "Expensive, exhausting, boundary-testing disasters, who I wouldn't trade for anything in the world." "See," Arthur said, "realistic but loving. That's good parenting." The conversation moved on, flowing naturally to other topics. Ginny's upcoming Quidditch tryouts for the Holyhead Harpies, Hermione's first day at the Ministry, Fred and George's plans for a new Weasley's Wizard Wheezes location, Charlie's latest dragon-related adventure. But Bill noticed the way Molly kept glancing at Fleur, the small smile that played at the corners of his mother's mouth, and he understood what she was thinking. Grandchildren, eventually, and I'll be ready to welcome them. It was hope, simple and profound. Hope for the future, for new life, for the family continuing and growing despite everything they'd lost. It was the kind of hope that made healing possible. As breakfast wound down and people began clearing plates, Fleur helping without being asked, falling naturally into the rhythm of dish clearing and spell casting that kept the kitchen functional. Molly caught Bill's eye and gestured toward the back door with her head. He followed her outside, into the bright morning sunshine where the gardens stretched green and overgrown and beautiful. The gnomes had indeed retreated, probably to their shed-based headquarters to plot whatever gnomes plotted. The chickens were pecking at grain George had scattered earlier. Everything was peaceful, ordinary, perfect. "Thank you," Molly said quietly, "for bringing her, for being patient with me, for not giving up even when I was being—" She struggled for words. Difficult, Bill supplied gently. Protective, scared. All of those things. I wasn't fair to her, Bill. I let my fear turn into something ugly, and I almost ruined something beautiful because I couldn't see past my own anxiety. Molly turned to face him fully, her expression serious. "She's remarkable, your Fleur. Strong and kind, and so much braver than I gave her credit for. I'm sorry it took me so long to see it." "She is remarkable," Bill agreed. "And she thinks you're pretty remarkable too. She told me last night, after we went upstairs, she said you reminded her of her grandmother, fierce and loving and willing to fight for your family even when the fighting hurts." Molly's eyes filled with tears. "That's the nicest thing anyone's ever said about me." "It's true." Bill pulled his mother into a hug, feeling her arms come around him tightly, desperately, in the way she'd been hugging him since he was small. "I love you, Mum. I love Fleur. I love that you're both trying. That's all I ever wanted." "I'll keep trying," Molly promised against his shoulder. "I'll make this right. I'll make her feel like she belongs here, like this is her home too. I promise." "You already are," Bill assured her. "You already are." They stood there for a moment, mother and son, in a garden that had witnessed decades of Weasley history. Childhood games and teenage heartbreaks and wedding preparations and war councils and everything in between. And now it was witnessing this. Reconciliation, acceptance, the building of new family bonds on the foundation of old ones. Inside the kitchen, Fleur was laughing at something Fred had said, the sound carrying through the open door like music. Hermione was explaining something complicated to Arthur, while Ron ate the last piece of bacon when he thought no one was looking. Ginny was spelling the dishes clean with excessive flourishes, making them dance through the air. George was trying to convince Molly that the Niffler could stay if he promised to keep it away from valuables. Molly was not convinced. It was noise and chaos and imperfection and love, all mixed together in the impossible architecture of the Burrow's crooked kitchen. It was home. Bill and Molly returned to the warmth and the noise together. And when Fleur looked up and smiled at him, at them, Bill felt something settle in his chest, something that had been unsettled since the moment he'd fallen in love with a beautiful French witch and wondered how she'd fit into his loud, messy, complicated family. She fit perfectly, as it turned out. Not because she was perfect, but because she was willing to try. Because she'd shown up and been vulnerable and broken things and tried again anyway. Because she'd chosen them and they'd chosen her. And choosing was always the most powerful magic. "Come on," Ginny said, grabbing Fleur's hand and pulling her towards the back door. "I want to show you the garden properly. Mum's got this whole section of French herbs she planted after Bill mentioned you liked cooking, and she's been too stubborn to admit she planted them specifically for you. But she did. Come see." Fleur allowed herself to be tugged outside, glancing back at Molly with an expression of delighted surprise. Molly flushed slightly but didn't deny it, just waved them on with a shooing motion that was trying to be dismissive, but came across as fond. The day stretched ahead of them, full of possibility and promise. Later, there would be lunch, something casual, probably sandwiches in the garden. Later still, Bill and Fleur would apparate back to Shell Cottage, to their own home, carrying with them the warmth of acceptance and the knowledge that they could come back any time, that there was a place set for them at the Burrow's crooked table. But for now, in this moment, they were simply here, simply together, simply family, in all the complicated, beautiful ways that word could mean. Outside, Fleur exclaimed over the herb garden, and Molly pretended she didn't hear, but her smile was soft and satisfied. Inside, Arthur asked if anyone wanted to see his toaster diagram, and everyone simultaneously said no, but he showed them anyway. The gnomes emerged from their hiding spots to resume their eternal quest for cabbage dominance. The chickens continued their pecking. The burrow settled around its inhabitants like a comfortable blanket, crooked and imperfect, and exactly right. And in the garden, in the sunshine, surrounded by people who had chosen each other again and again, despite the difficulty, despite the fear, despite everything, Fleur Delacour. Weasley looked around at her new family and thought, home, I am home. She was right. She was finally, completely, beautifully home.